Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a chapter of history that's rarely whispered about in textbooks, but was very much alive in candle-lit corners and shadowy cloisters. Lust, sex and sin in the Middle Ages. And before we start, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's too spicy, well maybe, but because if you'd lived in medieval times with a curious mind and an even slightly active libido, chances are you'd have ended up in the stocks, whipped or burned, or all three, depending on the week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start tonight's pilgrimage not in a bustling medieval town or a sultry tavern, but in a monastery. Yeah, not exactly where you expect to find a lot of sin. The air smells like candle wax, damp stone and something faintly medicinal. It's quiet, eerily so. The kind of quiet that makes every cough feel like a thunderclap. But even here, tucked away behind thick monastery walls and layers of vows, desire flickers like a stubborn flame. The monks around you wear wool robes, their hair shaved in a circular pattern known as the tonsure. They're supposed to have renounced the pleasures of the flesh. Lust is an enemy here, a prowling beast. And yet, you notice how Brother Thomas avoids Sister Agnes's gaze just a little too pointedly during Mass. His fingers twitch when she walks past. She, in turn, clutches her rosary tighter than seems strictly necessary. You learn quickly that this isn't some one-off scandal. Medieval monasteries were battlefields of the body. Monks and nuns fought constant, exhausting wars with their own thoughts. Sex was the original spiritual enemy, especially because you couldn't just banish it with fasting and cold baths. There were confessionals full of slippery accidents, dreams that left garments stained, and private moments with saints' statues that really didn't age well. One of the more bizarre features you discover is that monks kept records, detailed, awkwardly honest ones. There's a case of a 12th century abbot who confessed that the devil would show him visions of naked women in church. Yes, in church, during prayer. And did these visions tempt him? Oh, absolutely. He once described being so tormented he rammed his face into the cold floor to calm himself down. It didn't work, by the way. In fact, some monasteries became infamous for their not-so-holy behaviour. There's one story from France in the 11th century where the entire male and female communities of a double monastery were discovered in, let's call it, an elaborate entanglement. And not metaphorically. The church responded by shutting it down and calling the whole place a brothel in disguise. What makes this more ironic is how monastic life was sold as the ultimate escape from sin. Want to flee the temptations of the flesh? Easy. Take vows. Eat bland food. Chant Latin. Shave your head. But spoiler alert, it didn't work. If anything, isolation made things worse. Think about it. 0 distractions, long hours alone with your thoughts. The expectation of purity hanging over your head like a guillotine. That's basically an erotic pressure cooker. And don't think the women were exempt. Nuns wrote about their struggles too, sometimes in code, sometimes not. One 14th century nun described her nightmares of being seduced by black beasts with burning breath, classic incubus imagery, and wrote entire prayers begging God to harden her soul so she wouldn't... Well, you get the idea. There's even debate among historians about how many of these supernatural accounts were metaphorical versus an actual way to explain desire they couldn't process otherwise. Some scholars argue that calling it a demon was safer than saying I'm horny and I hate it. Now, let's take a quick detour to the stranger side of the monastery. Did you know some monks trained themselves to dream lucidly just so they could avoid lustful imagery while asleep? Like literal dream yoga, but the medieval Catholic guilt-saturated version. One obscure monk named Heinrich claimed he could recite psalms in his dreams to drown out any seductive thoughts. Was it true? Who knows? But the fact that they even tried that tells you how desperate they were. And then there's the elephant in the cloister, actual affairs. Despite all the rules, plenty of monks and nuns had secret relationships. Smuggled letters, nighttime visits, hidden tunnels. A few were even discovered with children. That's right, children. In some convents, pregnant nuns were quietly sent away to repent, and the child either ended up abandoned or mysteriously adopted by local villagers. The official line, miraculous conception or trickery by the devil. Sure, Jan. Still, not all monks were tragic cautionary tales. Some were fully committed to suppressing their desires, and a few managed it. There were saints who allegedly never once had a sexual thought, and others who claimed to have achieved total purity. But here's the debate. Did they really? Or were they just very good at hiding it, or redefining what pure meant in their journals? Either way, your stay in the monastery leaves you with this weird dual feeling, awe at the intensity of their struggle, and sympathy for the fact that these people were told that even thinking about sex meant damnation. That's a tough burden, especially when, let's be real, people are gonna people, even in 1142. You leave through a side door as the Vespers begin, the chant rising behind you like smoke. Outside, the moon hangs low, and somewhere nearby a nightbird calls. You're heading deeper into this medieval world now, where the line between holiness and horniness keeps getting blurrier. And next up, saints with visions that would definitely raise some eyebrows. You don't get far from the monastery before finding yourself wrapped in another tale, this one drenched in incense and mystery, flickering candlelight and sweaty hallucinations. Saints, those holy paragons, weren't exactly immune to lust either. In fact, the deeper you dig into their lives, the more you realise many of them spent years locked in what can only be described as deeply personal, occasionally erotic showdowns with the devil, and sometimes with God. You slip into the shoes of a medieval believer, somewhere between sceptical and spellbound, as you pore over the lives of saints, vitae, as the church called them. These weren't just dry moral summaries. Oh no, these stories came with plot twists, seductions, naked apparitions, physical torment, spiritual ecstasy that got confusingly close to the other kind. Take St. Anthony the Great, for example. The poor guy fled into the desert to escape temptation and wound up with even more of it. According to his biographers, demons sent visions of women throwing themselves at him. Their bodies shimmered, their eyes sparkled, and in a classic move, Anthony rolled around in a thorn bush to stop his impure thoughts, not metaphorically, like actually dove into it. You're not sure if that worked, but you can't deny the dedication. But it's not just men. The female saints get even weirder. Meet St. Catherine of Siena. She took a vow of virginity at 7. 7. As an adult, she claimed she was spiritually married to Christ, even receiving a ring that, according to her, was made from the foreskin of Jesus. Yep. You blink, reread, and there it is again. Foreskin. Medieval hagiography had no chill. And then there's St. Teresa of Avila. Although technically she lived a bit after the medieval period, her writings reflect centuries of mystical eroticism. She wrote of an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, causing her to writhe in pain and joy so intense it left her utterly consumed. If that sounds vaguely like a romance novel scene involving divine BDSM, you're not alone. Scholars still debate whether these visions were purely spiritual or whether Teresa was channeling suppressed desires into her metaphysical language. Some even argue she was having out-of-body orgasmic experiences and just didn't have the vocabulary for it, so she called them divine ecstasies. These accounts weren't fringe tales tucked away in dusty corners. They were popular, were widely read, even used as instructional material for other devout souls. The takeaway was clear. Spiritual perfection required confronting lust head-on, and the way you defeated it? Well, often by enduring increasingly surreal, occasionally sexy torments. But here's the twist that makes you raise an eyebrow. Sometimes the saints enjoyed the visions. There are passages where the tone shifts, from horror to awe, from disgust to wonder. Saint Lutgardis, a 13th century mystic, claimed that Christ kissed her on the mouth, like romantically. In one vision, his hands caressed her heart. She felt flooded with warmth and heard divine music. Was it symbolic? Maybe. Was it also the only acceptable framework for a woman in that society to describe any kind of intense pleasure? Almost definitely. That's where the open debate comes in. Were these saints truly transcending the flesh, or just finding loopholes? Some modern historians suggest these holy visions were often the only safe container women had to express desire, intimacy, and pleasure. A kind of spiritual drag show, where they slipped into a role society allowed and used it to say what they couldn't say openly. Even stranger, some of these visions mirrored common erotic tropes of the time. The swooning, the breathlessness, the feeling of being overcome, helpless. The language of religious ecstasy bled into erotic poetry and vice versa. And honestly, after a few hours reading through these saintly accounts, you start confusing them with courtship scenes from romance tales. One moment you're reading about a nun's dream of being enveloped in divine light, the next she's describing a sweetness unlike any earthly touch. You start suspecting these women had very vivid imaginations, and very few outlets. Meanwhile, the church walked a delicate tightrope. On the one hand, these mystical experiences were signs of divine favour. On the other, if a vision got too spicy, suspicions of heresy, madness, or even demonic possession weren't far behind. Plenty of mystics, especially women, walked that dangerous line. Be too pious, and you might be declared a living saint. Be too sensual about it, and you might find yourself on trial. You duck into a small chapel to catch your breath. Inside, there's a mural of St. Margaret holding a dragon by the tail, and honestly, it's not the most innocent image. Everything in this era had double meanings. That's what's so fascinating. No one could talk openly about sex, but everyone knew what they were dancing around. Saints, poets, even the bishops played this coded game. And of course, not every saint made it out unscathed. St. Christina the Astonishing, her name's not even the weirdest part, was said to levitate, throw herself into furnaces, and dive into icy rivers to resist temptation. Her entire biography reads like a medieval fever dream. Some think she suffered from epilepsy or a neurological condition, and her visions were misunderstood. Others see her as a mystic genuinely trying to wrestle with the contradictions of body and soul in a world that punished both extremes. You exit the chapel just as a bell tolls in the distance, another reminder of how closely time and ritual wrapped around desire in this world. These weren't just stories for the faithful, they were survival guides, cautionary tales, wish fulfillment, and if we're being honest, slightly erotic fanfic for people who couldn't read the Canterbury Tales without blushing. By the time you hit the road again, the saints feel less like flawless icons, and more like exhausted humans trying to make sense of overwhelming impulses. It's comforting in a strange way. Even the most divine couldn't escape desire's pull. They just found more elaborate, poetic ways to wrestle it. And speaking of poetic wrestling, you're headed next to the courts of love, where knights pine, ladies plot, and nobody's really as noble as the songs say. You arrive at a sprawling castle just as the sun begins to dip behind the towers, casting the stones in a warm golden hue that makes everything look slightly more romantic than it really is. Inside, a feast is being prepared. Roasted meats, spiced wine, fruit piled high, and you can already hear the pluck of lutes and the low drone of poetry recited in aching tones. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where desire is celebrated. Flirtation is an art form, and yet, absolutely no one seems to be getting laid. You take a seat in the great hall, observing the players of this peculiar game. Over there, a knight kneels before a noblewoman, eyes smouldering, voice trembling as he vows eternal loyalty. He praises her eyes, her grace, the way she walks across the floor like a swan on a lake, blah blah blah. She in turn accepts his devotion with just the right amount of disinterest. A raised eyebrow, a smile that could be mistaken for kindness or cruelty. They exchange tokens, a glove, a scarf, sometimes a literal lock of hair, but if he thinks that gets him anywhere near her chambers, think again. This is courtly love, refined, tortured, and, as you quickly realise, probably invented by someone who enjoyed emotional suffering. It's not about fulfillment, it's about the longing, the ideal, love that cannot, should not be consummated. That's what makes it pure. You start to wonder if this entire cultural obsession was the medieval version of edging. The poets of the time, troubadours and trouvères, specialised in this stuff. They'd travel from court to court singing of unattainable women and the agony of loving someone they could never touch. One of the most memorable was Chrétien de Troyes, who gave us tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, and other classic situations where true love is always just out of reach, or has to be kept secret because someone already said "I do" to a king or an enemy lord. And yes, while these stories were technically fiction, they shaped the actual behaviour of the nobility. People mimicked what they read. Ladies would flirt just enough to inspire devotion, but not so much as to lose control. Knights would perform absurd feats, jousting, slaying beasts, writing sonnets by candlelight, all for a single smile or whispered word. You start to think maybe the real reward was the performance itself. The idea that wanting was nobler than having. But here's the kicker. That's all on the surface. Scratch a little deeper, and it turns out these chaste declarations were often just a glossy cover for very real affairs. Especially at court, where political marriages were the norm, love often had to be found elsewhere. You trail a few couples into side corridors, watching the masks drop the moment they're alone. The longing becomes touching, the poetry becomes whispers, and the noble restraint becomes an excuse to sneak off behind the tapestry. One particularly juicy example, Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court of love. She's one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, and she basically hosted salons where ladies debated the rules of romantic behaviour like it was a medieval episode of The Bachelor. Should a man pursue a married woman? Should jealousy be encouraged? How do you test a lover's loyalty? It sounds all very polite and philosophical, until you realise many of the participants were embroiled in affairs of their own, often with the very knights writing those swoony poems. Still, this whole courtly love thing had strict rules. One big one. It was supposed to be non-physical. That kept it from being technically sinful. The church didn't love it, of course. It seemed suspiciously secular, all about earthly desire instead of divine love. But it was hard to condemn someone for saying they admired someone else's soul, especially when the admiration came with such lovely metaphors. But the lines blurred constantly. You discover a story of a nobleman who cut himself with a dagger to prove his devotion to a lady who refused him. She, moved by his gesture, agreed to a secret meeting. You'd think that's where things finally got physical, but nope, they just talked. She told him he'd earned her heart, and he promised to serve her until death. That was it. Everyone left disappointed, including you. And yet these relationships carried immense weight. A single flirtation could destroy reputations, ruin marriages, even spark wars. Kings got jealous, queens got clever, knights switched sides. You watch it unfold in slow motion, the way a look becomes a rumour, and a rumour becomes scandal. One lady of the court passes you and mutters, "It's not the love that's dangerous, it's the politics." She's not wrong. There's also the fringe theory you stumble across. Some scholars believe that courtly love was actually a kind of literary smokescreen for real-world power negotiations. Noble women, so often pawns in arranged marriages, used the rituals of courtly love to assert influence. By choosing who to favour, who to tease, who to shame in front of others, they subtly controlled social dynamics. So maybe that glove wasn't just a token, it was a chess move. And then there's the sex, or lack of it. Some historians argue that courtly love was a kind of proto-erotic theatre, a way to sublimate desire into something socially acceptable. Others insist there was sex, just hidden behind metaphor and poetic layers thick enough to confuse any chaperone. After all, medieval texts rarely said things outright. Instead of, they slept together, it was, he took shelter in her garden. You know, very subtle. By the end of the evening you realise you've been watching an elaborate masquerade. Everyone pretending to be above the flesh, while quietly negotiating access to it. Lust, here, wears a mask of longing. It's choreographed, constrained, and still somehow manages to burn through the silk and lace and fan fluttering like wildfire. You step outside the hall, the night cool and perfumed with rose petals and wine. Somewhere behind you, a poet is still reciting to a half-interested duchess. But you're headed somewhere different now. You've seen how the nobles pretend. It's time to see how the peasants really live, and how they get around having no privacy, no power, and no poems. You leave the glittering world of nobles behind. No more velvet drapes or lute music. No more fan dances of flirtation. Now the air is heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke and livestock. You're standing in the centre of a medieval village, somewhere in northern Europe, maybe England or France. The houses are cramped and close together, made of timber and thatch, and there's no such thing as personal space, let alone privacy. But that doesn't mean people here don't fall in love, or lust, or end up tangled in bedrolls on chilly nights. In fact, they often do, all without the luxury of silk bedsheets or carefully coded poetry. You peek into one of the cottages, ducking beneath the low doorway. The interior is a single room, one bed, maybe two if they're lucky. Parents, kids, and sometimes even a goat all sleep within feet of each other. And here's where things get resourceful. There's a tradition in some regions called bundling, or bed courtship, where a young couple, often in their teens, is allowed to lie together in bed with clothes on to talk, bond, and test their compatibility. Yes, you heard that right. In bed, together, usually with a wooden plank or a sackcloth between them, but still, more progressive than you'd expect. Of course, the idea was that they wouldn't have sex, that they'd just, hang out, supervised intimacy. But let's be honest, they were teenagers, they were curious, and that they were surrounded by hay. You do the math. And sometimes this led to what was charmingly called premarital negotiation. If a girl became pregnant, the community often expected the young man to marry her. Shotgun weddings weren't uncommon, and neither was the quiet acceptance that, hey, maybe the bundling bag was more symbolic than effective. What surprises you is how communal all this is. In a society where privacy is almost non-existent, the community becomes both witness and judge of romantic relationships. Neighbours gossip, families keep tabs, and public reputation can make or break a courtship. You hear about a ritual where village women would inspect the bed sheets after a wedding night to confirm consummation had occurred. If the sheet was bloody, all was well. If not, rumours flew. You wonder how many clever brides pre-stained the fabric just to avoid scandal. Sex among the peasantry isn't shrouded in the same performance of chastity as it is among the nobility. It's part of life. Practical, sometimes tender, sometimes hurried. You watch couples steal moments behind haystacks or in the forest, where birdsong and the rustle of leaves provide a thin veil of cover. A few are caught, sure, but punishment is often lighter than you'd expect. A small fine may be public penance. Everyone knows desire doesn't wait for the church's blessing. That said, there were rules, and crossing certain lines could be dangerous. Adultery, especially if it involved someone of higher status, could lead to exile, flogging, or worse. But among the lower classes, sexual transgressions were often handled within the community. You witness a strange custom called charivari, where a man who married a much younger woman, or someone suspected of infidelity, gets paraded through the village on a donkey, while people bang pots and yell insults. It's half punishment, half performance, and it reeks of petty vengeance disguised as moral outrage. Still, there's humour here too, a kind of earthy acceptance. One local midwife, a stout woman with a gap-toothed smile, pulls you aside and says, "The Lord can keep his sermons, babies come when they want." She's attended dozens of births, some from married couples, some not, and doesn't seem particularly scandalised by any of it. She even jokes about how many noblemen have left their blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a thing. Noblemen would sometimes use their power to take advantage of peasant girls, leading to awkwardly mixed-status children who are often quietly absorbed into the village fabric, or not so quietly cast out. One thing that stands out is how marriage itself isn't always a grand event down here. Sometimes it's just a handshake in front of witnesses, a verbal agreement that they'll share work, food and a bed. The church wants a priest involved, of course, but in many cases, local custom rules the day. If you live together, if everyone sees you as a couple, then that's that. It's marriage by consensus, and surprisingly flexible until it isn't. Of course, there's always someone watching from the margins. You meet an old widow who whispers about the woods women, young girls who disappeared into the forest to avoid shame after a pregnancy, or who practice their own kind of folk magic to control fertility. There are herbs passed in secret, teas that bring on the moon, and charms tied under skirts. Some of it's practical, some of it's superstition. All of it reveals how deeply women tried to maintain control in a world that often denied them agency. And this is where you hit the quirky fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, young couples would carve love runes into tree bark, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If they couldn't afford a priest's blessing, the tree would do. It was natural, eternal, and frankly more available than a bishop. You pass one such tree, hearts carved into the bark, initials barely legible, and wonder how many generations of secret love stories it's absorbed. Scholars still argue about just how common sex before marriage was among peasants. Some point to church records full of fines and punishments. Others say those records only show the rare cases that caused scandal. What's clear is that the rules on paper and the reality in the field rarely lined up. Desire finds cracks. It grows in the shadows. And in medieval villages, it shaped lives in ways more honest, and sometimes more humane, than all the noble poetry in the world. You leave the village behind, your boots muddy, your mind swirling with images of flickering hearths, whispered promises, and stolen kisses behind barn doors. The peasants may not have had silks or ballads, but they had passion, risk, and moments of tenderness carved into the bark of trees. Next, you're heading back to the cloisters, but this time the women are running the show. nuns with ink-stained fingers and some surprisingly spicy secrets. You step through a creaking wooden gate into the walled stillness of a convent, half expecting to be met with angelic chanting and the scent of incense. Instead, you're greeted by the sharp tang of vinegar and a surprising note of roasted onions drifting from the kitchen garden. The air is clean but thick with unspoken stories. Nuns glide across the courtyard with practised grace, habits flapping in the breeze, eyes lowered, hands folded. Yet behind the serenity there's a pulse. Something vibrant and human beats beneath the linen and Latin. You can almost feel it. Inside the convent walls, it's supposed to be a sanctuary from sin, a haven from temptation, and a place where women devote themselves entirely to God. And sure, on the surface, everything follows the script. There are prayers, chants, hours of silence, and manuscripts copied with almost obsessive precision. But soon, you realise this place is far more than a retreat from the flesh. It's a community of women, thinking, feeling, dreaming, and yes, occasionally fantasising just like everyone else in medieval society. And they kept records. You find yourself in the convent library, where the air smells of old parchment and beeswax. One of the sisters, older and quietly amused by your curiosity, unlocks a cabinet and shows you something few outsiders ever see. The private writings of nuns. Not doctrine, not psalters, not dry theological commentary. No, what she lays before you are diaries, fragile collections of yearning and shame, visions and desire scribbled between prayers and poems. Some of it spiritual, yes, but not always the way you'd expect. One entry you read describes a dream where the writer sees the Virgin Mary cradling her with a tenderness that sounds less like maternal comfort and more like an overwhelming wave of bliss. Another recounts being kissed on the mouth by an angel again and again, until she wakes up gasping, convinced she's either blessed or damned. You're not sure which one she wants more. One nun writes about a fellow sister's golden hair like summer wheat, and the gentle weight of her hand during prayer. It reads like longing, quiet, intimate, almost mournful. It never says anything overt, but the undertones are undeniable, and it turns out this wasn't an isolated case. In convents across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have found letters and poems passed between women, sometimes coded, sometimes shockingly direct. One nun in Germany wrote of her hunger for the warmth of Sister Clara's body. Another, in a tiny outpost in France, confessed that she sought God's mercy for dreaming of carnal joy while sharing a bed in winter. You pause here, wait, sharing a bed? Oh yes, convent dormitories were communal, often with 2 or more nuns per straw mattress in colder seasons. It was practical, economical, and in some cases, an unexpected invitation for intimacy. While rules forbade physical affection, enforcement was inconsistent. After all, there weren't cameras or DNA tests, just a lot of dim candlelight, heavy robes, and human need. Still, not everything was hidden. In fact, some abbesses kept astonishingly honest records of misbehaviour. You come across one case where a nun was caught with a visiting monk, under a staircase no less. Another was discovered with a local butcher's daughter, who'd been smuggled into the grounds disguised as a laundry assistant. In most cases, the punishment was temporary seclusion, extra prayers, and a stern talk. But sometimes, especially if noble families were involved, scandals were buried entirely. And then there were the love tokens, small crosses, carved charms, notes tucked into rosary pouches. One nun buried a letter beneath the roots of a cherry tree, addressed to the one whose voice haunts me in sleep. She never signed it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the convent knew, but it wasn't always about sex or forbidden love. Many of these women were intellectual powerhouses, starved for stimulation. They read everything, Augustine, Plato, even Roman poets if they could get away with it. They debated theology late into the night, translated texts, and wrote mystical reflections that, when you squint just a little, sound like erotic poetry disguised in the language of piety. One visionary nun describes her soul being pierced by a divine flame and opened like a flower to the light. If that's not metaphorical foreplay, you don't know what is. Now here's your fringe fact for the night. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, composer and mystic, once wrote that a woman's soul could become pregnant with divine inspiration, an idea that some modern readers interpret as spiritual queerness. She also had an intense, possibly romantic bond with another nun named Richardis. which ended in a heartbroken flurry of letters when Richardis was transferred to another convent. Hildegard's grief reads like a breakup album in Latin. Of course, modern scholars debate what all of this means. Were these relationships romantic, platonic, emotional coping mechanisms in an all-female environment? Did nuns understand their own desires in the way we frame sexuality today? There's no single answer. What's clear is that these women lived full, complex emotional lives, far from the image of passive celibate angels that church propaganda liked to project. You also learn that many women didn't choose the convent freely. Families often sent daughters here as a financial decision or political strategy. If you weren't beautiful enough to marry advantageously or had too many sisters ahead of you, off to the nunnery you went. Some embraced it, others didn't. One diary has a single heartbreaking line: "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." It hits harder than any sermon. And let's not forget the occasional outliers, the rebellious nuns who snuck out of the convent at night, visited taverns, and even took lovers. In 14th century Italy, one group of nuns was discovered hosting masked dances in their cloister complete with hired musicians. When church officials arrived, they found wine, laughter, and a suspicious lack of guilt. The women were reprimanded, of course, but not expelled. Why? Because some of them were related to bishops. Surprise! As you walk back through the cloisters, moonlight falling through arched windows, you hear the echo of a hymn rising from the chapel. It's beautiful, haunting, but layered beneath the melody is the undeniable truth that these women, so often imagined as blank slates of virtue, were just as full of longing, conflict, imagination and secrets as anyone else. Maybe even more so, tucked away from the world with only candlelight and each other for company. Next you'll slide into a confession booth, where the air is thick with incense and whispered sin, and on the other side of the screen, a priest who might be more familiar with temptation than you'd expect. You step into the shadowed hush of a stone church, where stained glass throws scattered pools of coloured light across worn pews, and the scent of centuries-old incense clings to every surface. The altar gleams in the distance, but your attention is drawn to a far darker corner, the confessional booth. It's an odd little wooden structure, like a confessional closet with secrets wedged into its grain. You slip inside, close the curtain, and find yourself breathing the same musty air as generations of sinners who've crouched here before you. On the other side of the screen, a priest clears his throat, and what unfolds isn't exactly what you'd expect. In theory, the medieval confessional is a sacred space, a channel for cleansing the soul, a ritual for laying bare one's most shameful desires before God. But in practice, well, that's where things get complicated. Because the person behind the screen isn't just a holy man, he's human, with ears and curiosity and, let's be honest, sometimes questionable restraint. Confessions could be brutally explicit. People came to priests not only to beg forgiveness, but also to ask whether the particular thing they did with their spouse, or their neighbour, or a travelling minstrel technically counted as a sin. You hear one such confession, a young man trembling as he whispers that he allowed a girl to touch his shameful member while bathing. The priest responds not with outrage, but with a series of probing questions, some of which sound less like spiritual guidance and more like personal research. That's not entirely surprising. Priests were often the most educated men in the village, but that didn't make them immune to lust. In fact, some had more access to temptation than most. Parish priests were supposed to be celibate, mandated by church law since the 12th century, but enforcement was patchy, and rural communities weren't exactly brimming with watchful bishops. So when the local priest took a mistress, everyone kind of looked the other way, unless he got too bold. You come across the story of Father Gerard, who had a reputation for hearing certain women's confessions in private and for taking a suspiciously long time doing so. One widow confessed to him weekly, always after dusk, and neighbours reported seeing candlelight in the rectory window well past midnight. Eventually a bishop investigated, and Gerard was quietly reassigned to a monastery up north. No trial, no punishment, just a new location and presumably a whole new batch of souls to guide. But even the well-meaning priests weren't above strange behaviour. One particularly pious friar, Brother Luca, kept a ledger where he tallied how many times his parishioners confessed sins of the flesh. Not their names, mind you, just the nature and frequency. The resulting data is bizarre. He noted trends like Mondays higher in self-pollution confessions, and married women report impure dreams more frequently than maids. Whether it was a spiritual census or an obsession with other people's intimacy, it's hard to say. And here's a particularly odd little fact you uncover. Some priests handed out very specific penances for sexual sins. Not just say 5 Hail Marys, but stuff like walk barefoot to the chapel 3 times while reciting Psalm 51s, or fast for 40 days and sleep only on stones. In one outrageous case, a man who admitted to bestiality was told to carry a candle larger than himself through town during Mass. Yes, really, the public shame was the point, but whether it deterred others, questionable. And it wasn't just the laity spilling secrets. Priests themselves sometimes confessed, to each other in secret or to their superiors when guilt finally tipped the scale. There are records of priests admitting to sleeping with nuns, with widows, even with their own housekeepers. Some expressed genuine remorse. Others offered justifications. She was lonely. I thought we were married in God's eyes. One particularly bold priest simply wrote, "The flesh was stronger than the soul, I regret little." Of course, not all priests were libertines in robes. Many took their vows seriously, wrestled with their desires, and confessed their own thoughts with anguish. But even they weren't spared suspicion. A priest who was too handsome, too gentle, or too friendly with women might be accused of inappropriate behaviour regardless of whether he ever slipped. In a world where sex and sin were tangled into a single knot, even a warm smile could be a scandal waiting to bloom. You also hear about female confessors. Not many, but they existed in certain religious orders. And the contrast is stark. They were often stricter, more clinical, and less easily scandalised. Some women, in fact, preferred confessing to a fellow woman, especially when the sin involved matters of the body. Imagine trying to tell a red-faced young priest about a sensual dream involving Saint Sebastian. Now imagine telling someone who's had a few herself. Still, confession was often less about forgiveness and more about control. The church gathered immense power by being the repository of everyone's secrets. They knew who slept where, who loved whom, who wanted what. And they used that information to maintain moral order, sure, but also to exert influence. A noble who confessed to adultery might find himself advised to donate a new chapel. A baker who visited a brothel too often might mysteriously lose his market stall. Guilt became currency. And here's where the scholarly debate flares up. Some historians argue that the confessional booth was less a space of spiritual healing and more a tool of psychological surveillance, an early form of institutional control that kept people obsessed with their own moral failings. Others insist it gave people relief, a place to talk about things they had no other outlet for. The truth, as always, is probably a mix. Confession was simultaneously a therapy session, a trap, a relief, and a risk. You finally leave the booth, the carved wood creaking behind you. Outside, the sun is dipping low and the sound of bells rolls out across the town like a warning. You've heard so many sins whispered into the dark, and not all of them stayed hidden. Some turned into gossip, some grew into scandal, and some shaped the way entire communities saw themselves. As you cross the courtyard, you realise that in this world, sin wasn't just an act. It was a story, a confession waiting to be told, a burden begging to be passed to someone else. And up next, you'll be standing in the town square when private pleasure becomes a very public spectacle. The square is already buzzing by the time you arrive, the kind of low, anticipatory hum that comes before a storm, or in this case a public shaming. You push your way through the gathered crowd of villagers, cloaked merchants, and toothless old women with baskets at their feet. Everyone's eyes are locked on a wooden platform in the centre, where a pair of stocks has been dusted off and freshly oiled. Next to it, a barrel filled with rotten vegetables. Welcome to medieval justice, where sin doesn't just haunt your soul, it gets a full, painfully public performance. Today's unfortunate star is a woman in her 30s, hair wild and face flushed, not from embarrassment you suspect, but from sheer fury. She's been accused of adultery, though the details are vague. The man involved isn't present. He never is. She, on the other hand, is about to spend the afternoon in the stocks with her ankles and wrists locked in place, while the townsfolk do what they always do best, judge, jeer and throw things. You feel it instantly. This isn't about justice. It's theatre. The whole town's come out, not just to punish sin, but to enjoy it. Children laugh as they wind up with squishy turnips. A drunk cobbler yells something about loose women before nearly falling into a pig trough. But it's not all fun and games. There's a thick current of cruelty here too. The crowd loves watching someone fall, especially a woman who dared to want something she wasn't supposed to. Public punishment for sexual offences was surprisingly common in medieval towns. Adultery, fornication, and even bawdy speech could land you in the pillory, or worse. Sometimes it was just a fine or a public whipping. Other times it was exile, a shaved head, or a brand burned into the flesh. The punishments varied by region, social status, and gender, but the message was always the same. Lust is dangerous, and if you act on it, you better be ready to pay the price. You learn that married women bore the brunt of these punishments. If a wife strayed even emotionally, it was considered a betrayal not just of her husband but of the social order. A man, on the other hand, could often get away with an affair, especially if he claimed the woman seduced him. You see this double standard play out in the records. Men caught with prostitutes were sometimes fined. Women labelled as prostitutes could be whipped, branded, or forced to wear humiliating clothing. In one town they had to wear striped hoods whenever in public, a scarlet letter sewn into linen. And the punishments weren't just for real sex. You stumble upon a set of court records detailing the public humiliation of a man accused of cross-dressing in secret. His crime? Wearing his wife's dress while cleaning the house and, allegedly, dancing alone. No sexual contact, no victim, but he was dragged into the town square, forced to wear women's clothes in front of everyone while being pelted with sheep dung. It wasn't about morality, it was about enforcing roles, staying in your lane, being what your body told them you should be. Then there's the case of the Board, a woman who ran an unofficial brothel out of her cellar. When she was caught, she wasn't executed or imprisoned. Instead, she was paraded through the town in a cart holding a sign that read Mother of Whores. The church loved this kind of punishment. It didn't just shame, it warned. Her neighbours, friends, and maybe even former clients watched in silence as she passed, faces carefully blank. No one wanted to be next. Still, not all public punishments were for the big, scandalous sins. Sometimes you'd get dragged into the square for simply being too loud in your flirtation, too bold in your innuendo. One woman in Norwich was pilloried for calling a merchant's apprentice ripe fruit in the market. Her real crime? Doing it in front of the wrong priest's wife. There was a fine line between flirtation and transgression, and sometimes it came down to who was listening. And here's your quirky, almost unbelievable detail for the night. In parts of medieval France, married couples caught fighting about infidelity were forced to literally kiss and make up in public. They'd be led to the market square, sometimes in chains, and forced to kneel before each other, confess their faults and kiss. If they refused, they risked heavier penalties. Imagine being forced to apologise with garlic on your breath and half the town watching. Welcome to Romance, Medieval Edition. There's debate among scholars about whether these public punishments actually deterred sin or simply provided a pressure valve, a way for communities to reinforce norms and shame those who didn't conform. Some historians argue that the public nature of these events made them ritualistic, almost theatrical, and that the real purpose wasn't justice but unity. If everyone booed the same person, they'd feel better about their own hidden sins. Others believe these spectacles were more about power, about reminding people who made the rules and who could break them. Back in the square, the woman in the stocks has gone quiet. Her eyes are fixed on a distant point beyond the jeering crowd. The vegetables have stopped flying. People are losing interest. Someone starts playing a flute. The moment's passed. Tomorrow someone else will be in her place. A drunk, a thief, maybe another lover who made the wrong move at the wrong time. You step away from the square, boots crunching over cabbage leaves and broken shame. The sun's low now, casting long shadows. It's strange how easily pleasure flips into punishment here. How the things people crave become the weapons used against them. And yet, despite the risk, they still keep craving. Next, you'll head into darker territory, where lust isn't just punished, but demonized. Lettre de la. A woman is about to stand trial for consorting with something infernal. You might want to keep your crucifix handy. You arrive at the edge of a village just as the torches are being lit, their flames casting jagged shadows across the timber-framed houses. The air is heavy with damp earth and wood smoke, but there's something else underneath it, something sharper. Fear. It moves like a fog through the streets, thickening near the church where a crowd has gathered. They're not here for prayer, they're here for a trial. And not just any trial, this is the kind where accusations burn hotter than facts and demons are given names. A woman is being accused of laying with the devil himself. Her name is Isabeau, mid-30s, widowed, herbalist, mother of 2, and unfortunately for her, she's also attractive, self-sufficient, and rumoured to know which plants bring on the blood or still a restless husband. These days, that's enough to get you branded a witch. But when you squeeze through the crowd and get a glimpse of her, hands bound, dress torn at the sleeve, eyes burning with fury, you can tell this is about more than herbs or local gossip. Someone's accused her of sex with a demon, and everyone seems a little too ready to believe it. The priest, puffed up with righteousness and beard oil, reads the charges aloud in a voice that wavers just enough to sound theatrical. She did consort with a demon in the likeness of a man. She did allow the creature to enter her body through unholy means. She did cry out in pleasure rather than pain. The crowd shifts, murmurs ripple, some cross themselves, others look a little too curious. You find yourself leaning in too. Not out of voyeurism, okay, maybe a little, but because you know how these stories go. Isabeau won't just be questioned about her soul. They'll want details. What did the demon look like? Did it have claws or hooves? Did it speak in tongues or whisper sweet nothings in her ear? And yes, that's what they're asking. Right now, with a notary writing it all down. What's wild is how detailed these demon sex accounts often were. Inquisition records are filled with women describing creatures that visited them at night. Sometimes handsome, sometimes monstrous. Some came as lovers, others as rapists. Some seduced with soft words and warm hands. Others forced themselves into dreams like a sickness. But no matter how the women described it, the church had a script ready. These were incubi, male demons who tempted women into sin, stole their seed, and used it to breed more evil. Conveniently, it explained everything from sleep paralysis to sexual desire to why someone's sheets might be damp in the morning. You hear Isabeau's voice cut through the crowd, defiant, trembling. She says the devil came in the form of her dead husband, that she dreamt of him touching her, kissing her, lying beside her just like he used to, that it felt real, that she wanted it to be real. And just like that, the crowd shifts again, some to sympathy, others to horror, because she admitted the most dangerous thing of all, that she enjoyed it. The irony here is so thick you could spoon it. The same church leaders who rail against desire also believe that demons spend all their time seducing people, especially women, especially at night, especially in ways that just happen to line up with people's actual suppressed fantasies. There's something darkly hilarious about that. Or tragic, or both. And then comes the inspection. Yes, the physical kind. A midwife is brought forward to search Isabeau's body for a witch's mark, some mole, blemish, or patch of skin insensible to pain. You watch as she's forced to strip under torchlight while strangers examine her for proof that she's been suckled by a demon. It's invasive, humiliating, and worse, it's deadly serious. Because if they find something, anything, it's game over. They do, of course, a freckle on her inner thigh. That's all it takes. The priest declares it the devil's kiss, and just like that, the weight of the accusation becomes impossible to shrug off. But here's where the scholarly debates rage. Did these women really believe they'd slept with demons? Were they describing vivid dreams filtered through religious fear, or inventing stories under torture? Or were these confessions shaped entirely by their interrogators, desperate women saying what they thought would stop the pain, or align with what they were told had to be true? Some historians argue that these were simply erotic dreams, misunderstood by both the dreamer and the society. Others suggest the church itself projected sexual panic onto the accused as a way to police not just sin, but female autonomy. Because here's the thing, many of these so-called witches weren't seductresses or Satanists. They were healers, widows, midwives, herbalists, women who lived alone or knew too much or refused to obey. Their real crime wasn't consorting with demons, it was not fitting the mould. Lust became the easiest crime to pin on them because it made the story salacious, attention-grabbing and impossible to prove or disprove, and if she enjoyed it, that made her even more dangerous. Because a woman who likes sex is apparently halfway to hell. You discover a chilling detail buried in an old judicial report. In some trials, women were asked to describe how the demon's seed felt inside them. The assumption was that it would be ice-cold proof of infernal origins. If they said it was warm or if they hesitated, it meant they were lying. That's how far the church went, using imaginary semen temperature as a tool of damnation. You don't know whether to laugh or scream. As the torchlight flickers across the square, the verdict is pronounced: guilty. Isabeau is sentenced to public penance and flogging. She'll be marched through town barefoot in a chemise, holding a candle taller than she is. If she survives that humiliation, she might be allowed to return to her home, or she might disappear like so many others, burned quietly without record. You step away as the crowd disperses, stunned and chatty, already embellishing the story for tomorrow's gossip. A few whisper that Isabeau flew at night. Others claim she gave birth to a toad. The line between sex and sorcery is razor thin here, and razor sharp. Next you'll take a closer look at the objects designed to stop all this sin before it starts. Devices of virtue, control, and maybe a touch of kink. Yes, it's time to talk about chastity belts. You're standing in a small chamber at the back of a fortress. Stone walls damp, ceiling low enough to make you duck. On a wooden table lies the object of your curiosity, gleaming under a single shaft of sunlight like some kind of divine joke. A chastity belt, iron, leather-lined, cold to the touch. It's got a front plate that covers everything with a cruel kind of elegance, pierced with holes for hygiene, or so they say, and locked at the hips with a key the size of a baby goat. Welcome to the awkward intersection of lust, fear, and medieval engineering. The myth of the chastity belt is powerful. You've probably heard it a dozen ways. Noble knights locking up their wives before heading off on crusade, women sealed into metal underwear to keep them pure, keys worn around husbands' necks like twisted wedding rings. It's got all the makings of a dark fairy tale. But as you look closer, you start to notice something strange. This belt is a little too ornate, a little too pristine, almost like it was made to be looked at, not worn, and that's the first clue that things aren't as straightforward as they seem. Historians are still arguing over whether chastity belts were ever widely used, or used at all. Sure, there are museum displays and the occasional drawing from the Renaissance that shows women strapped into these torture panties of shame. But the earliest physical belts we have, most date from the 15th century or later, and some look suspiciously like 19th century forgeries designed to titillate more than terrify. That's right, some medieval chastity belts may be the historical equivalent of cosplay props for Victorian gentlemen with very specific tastes. Still, the idea had roots. The church was obsessed with controlling female sexuality, and chastity was practically currency. Virginity wasn't just a moral state, it was a bargaining chip in marriage, a symbol of family honour, and a theological ideal. So the idea of locking it down literally fit right into the broader culture of control. Whether or not women were walking around wearing iron thongs, the threat, the metaphor, and the obsession sin were very real. You leaf through some old manuscripts and find a few references, none of them exactly flattering. One Italian text describes a jealous merchant who commissioned a belt from a blacksmith to preserve the virtue of his young wife. Another chronicles a paranoid noble who required his daughters to be secured whenever they left the estate. No one says how long they wore them, how they bathed, or how infections were handled. You begin to suspect those details were conveniently left out or completely imagined. But there are weirder facts too. Some belts were designed not just to prevent intercourse, but to prevent pleasure. One model has little spikes on the inside, almost like a reverse hedgehog. Another features a mechanism that makes walking normally almost impossible. Some researchers believe these were punishment devices, not preventative ones, used to discipline unruly women or sex workers in particularly cruel city-states. Whether those were isolated cases or part of a larger practice, that's still hotly debated. And it's not just women. You stumble upon a sketch of a male chastity device, an iron codpiece that looks like a meat grinder. Apparently some men were forced to wear these during periods of penance, or by their wives as revenge for infidelity. There's even one bizarre story, possibly apocryphal, about a young monk who asked to be locked by his abbot to keep his urges in check. Talk about commitment to the cause. Still, for all the physical evidence, or lack thereof, the idea of the chastity belt loomed large in the medieval imagination. Poets wrote about it, preachers warned of it, satirists mocked it. One bawdy French ballad describes a woman outsmarting the belt by bribing a locksmith, then having a tryst with 3 different suitors before morning prayers. Another joke goes that a knight returns from the Holy Land to find his wife not only pregnant, but wearing the belt, with the key still on his neck. The message? Where there's a will, there's a workaround. You find a quirky little record from Nuremberg in the 1500s of a man who tried to sell a virtue-preserving device at a public market. The city council ordered him flogged, not because the device was immoral, but because the whole idea was considered fraudulent and ridiculous. Apparently, even then, people were side-eyeing the practicality of strapping someone into medieval Tupperware and expecting it to end well. Modern scholars often argue that the chastity belt became more symbolic than real. A metaphor for control, a tool of propaganda, a warning. By the time the Renaissance rolled in, the image of the belt was being used in paintings and pamphlets more as commentary on jealousy, power, and hypocrisy than actual practice. In that sense, it's a cousin to the scold's bridle, or the shame flute, devices that may have existed but whose myth outgrew their use. And yet, as you hold one of the replicas in your hands, cool, heavy, impossibly uncomfortable, you realise something. Real or not, it feels medieval, brutal, controlling, deeply distrustful of the body, which means it fits perfectly into the world you've been wandering through, where sin is feared, punished, and always lurking just under the surface of virtue. Whether anyone actually wore one might matter less than the fact that everyone believed someone could. You leave the fortress behind, passing through a courtyard where lovers once danced under banners and suspicion. Your thoughts swirl with iron and fire, with the absurdity of locking up lust and pretending that would be enough to make it disappear. And now you're heading to a wedding, not for love, but for duty. And the guests, more interested in the bridal sheets than the bride and groom. You arrive just in time for the wedding feast. A blur of roasted meat, sticky wine, laughter thick with onions, and nobles in velvet laughing a little too loudly. The bride and groom sit beneath a canopy of embroidered cloth, looking like two strangers stuck in the world's most awkward team-building exercise. She's pale and stiff, glancing down at her hands like she's trying to vanish. He's already 3 goblets deep and grinning at something that probably isn't funny. No one here seems concerned about love. They're waiting for the real show, the bedding ceremony. Yes, the moment when all pretense drops and the new couple is escorted, often publicly, to their marriage bed. The crowd doesn't even try to be subtle. They're chanting songs, cracking jokes, making crude rhymes about fruit and animals. If this feels absurdly invasive, it's because it is. But in medieval Europe, this was normal. The marriage wasn't considered valid until consummated, and sometimes the proof wasn't just expected, it was required. You trail the procession up narrow stairs lit with sputtering candles, where the newlyweds are deposited in their chamber like livestock in a pen. Onlookers, nobles, clergy, servants, even the bride's aunt, gather around the bed as the couple is undressed. There are rules, of course. No touching, just watching, encouraging, teasing. A few throw flower petals. One knight plays a lute. It's surreal. The couple climbs under the sheets, and then the curtains are drawn, halfway, because the moment they finish, everyone wants to know. You'd think this kind of spectacle would kill the mood, but that wasn't the point. This ritual wasn't about intimacy, it was about legitimacy. Marriages in the medieval world weren't romantic contracts. They were economic alliances, political chess moves or strategies to transfer land and titles. And to make them binding, there had to be evidence of consummation. That brings you to the infamous bridal sheet inspection. In many places, after the deed was done, or in some cases claimed to be done, the bed linens were displayed, often outside the house, so the blood could prove the bride's virginity. Red spots meant purity, honour, and a good investment. No stains? That was a problem. Rumours could erupt, dowries could be returned, families could feud. In one recorded case, a groom annulled the marriage on the spot and demanded his money back. The bride was 15. Her father sued for slander. The court ruled in favour of the bedsheet. Of course, not every woman bled, and many knew it. So some got clever. There are whispered accounts of brides pricking their fingers, slipping animal blood under the sheet, or bribing servants to vouch for what didn't actually happen. One merchant's daughter allegedly kept a vial of chicken blood hidden in her corset just in case. Virginity was such a commodity that entire fates hinged on the appearance, not the reality of it. And the groom? Well, no one cared whether he was a virgin. In fact, it was often expected that he wasn't. Men were told to train before marriage, sometimes with prostitutes, to ensure they could perform when it mattered. You find a treatise from a Spanish physician warning young husbands to avoid overexcitement and ungoverned haste, lest the bride remain dissatisfied and suspicious. So while she was expected to arrive untouched, he was expected to arrive skilled. Equal footing this was not. You come across one particularly strange tradition from Central Europe, where the bride's mother would remain in the room, not to watch the act, but to supervise decency. She'd sit in a corner chair, eyes politely averted, hands folded, humming to herself, as if that somehow made things better. In other cases, a priest would bless the bed, literally sprinkle it with holy water, and then offer instructions to the couple before tiptoeing out. "Be fruitful," he'd whisper, "and remember that Christ is watching." No pressure. Here's your oddball fact of the night. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, if a marriage wasn't consummated within 3 days, it could be legally annulled, and people checked. One story tells of a young noblewoman whose husband was too timid or too uninterested to touch her. On day 4, the bishop sent an investigator to the bedroom. When the sheets were clean and the servants wide-eyed with disappointment, the marriage was dissolved. The husband joined a monastery. The bride remarried a week later to her cousin. Even when there wasn't a formal inspection, rumours were dangerous. A new bride who seemed too cheerful or too sore could become the target of gossip. If she limped, some whispered she'd lost her virginity before the wedding. If she glowed too much, maybe she enjoyed it too much, which was also suspicious. Either way, people were obsessed with bedroom details that weren't their business. And that's where the debate still simmers. How much of this was actual practice and how much was theatrical tradition? Some historians argue that public bedding rituals were more common among the nobility and mostly symbolic. Others insist they happened in middle-class homes, with neighbours poking their heads in for a peek. There's even a theory that some of the stories are later exaggerations, Renaissance authors mocking the past. But either way, the message was clear. Your body was not just yours, it was property, proof, a legal hinge. As the chamber quiets and the crowd drifts back to their wine, you peek through the curtain. The bride lies still, eyes open. The groom is snoring. The sheet, folded at the end of the bed, already being eyed by the nursemaid. Whether there's blood on it or not, the judgment will come either way. You slip back downstairs as the music resumes, your stomach queasy. Not from the food, but from the sense that nothing about this night was truly private. Not the vows, not the bed, not the love, if it existed at all. Next, you're ducking into a church pew to hear what the priests say about all this. Spoiler, they're not thrilled. And they say they've got a sermon that's about to make you regret your entire body. You slip into the back of the church just as the priest mounts the pulpit, robes swishing like a curtain rising on a one-man morality play. The pews are packed. Peasants, merchants, and a few nobles packed in for the Sunday sermon, and even the air seems heavy, thick with dust, incense and anxiety. The priest clears his throat, lifts his arms with theatrical flair, and begins. The topic? Lust. Again. Always. He starts with a warning. The body is a vessel for temptation, he intones, and lust is its captain, steering us straight into damnation. You lean back, half curious, half dreading what comes next. Spoiler, it's not going to be subtle. The sermon rolls forward like a war drum. Sex outside of marriage is sin. Sex in marriage without the intent of procreation, also sin. Thinking about sex, sin. Looking at someone with desire, double sin. You can almost hear the collective clench of an entire village trying not to remember last night. The church, especially in the later Middle Ages, was on an all-out mission to control the human body, and nowhere did it try harder than in the realm of sexuality. You read some of the texts used to guide confession and preaching, and they're more graphic than any romance novel. They categorise sins down to the position, the frequency of all, and even the mood. Did you enjoy it? That's worse. Did you do it with the intention of mutual delight? That's practically Satanism. And yes, there were official lists. One document from the 13th century lists over 30 unlawful sexual positions, along with penalties. Some priests told couples that only missionary was acceptable. Others believed even that was suspect if there was too much groaning. One preacher famously warned his congregation that even a kissing with tongue could summon demons. You look around the church and wonder how anyone managed to procreate at all. The priest thunders on, quoting Augustine, the father of Christian guilt, who insisted that the only justification for sex was to produce children, and even then you should feel a little bad about it. According to him and a slew of medieval theologians, desire was a byproduct of the fall. Adam and Eve? They ruined everything. Lust is not love. Lust is proof of our brokenness. If you enjoy sex, it's because sin lives in your flesh. No amount of rosaries can scrub that out. You catch the eye of a woman 2 rows up who looks like she's trying not to laugh or cry. It's hard to tell. Maybe she's thinking about the night before. Or maybe, like you, she's just exhausted by the contradiction. Everyone's expected to marry, have kids, populate the Christian kingdom, but also to pretend sex is this joyless, guilt-ridden duty that must never be enjoyed. It's like being told to bake a cake without tasting the batter or smiling while you do it. And yet the church didn't ignore sex. It obsessed over it. Monks wrote treatises on the dangers of nocturnal emissions, pollution they called it, because clearly spontaneous arousal meant the devil was rifling through your dreams. There were entire theological debates over whether married couples could have sex on Sundays, feast days, or during Lent. Answer: usually no, but maybe if you really, really needed to and cried afterward. One friar you read about, Brother Peter, bless him, argued that even married couples who loved each other too much were guilty of sin if their affection led to pleasure. He warned that too much joy in the marriage bed would soften the heart and weaken the soul. You wonder what his own bed looked like. Probably a plank of wood and a bad attitude. Still, not all churchmen were full-on killjoys. A few quietly admitted that desire was natural, even useful in the context of marriage. Some theologians wrote that affection between spouses was a gift from God, a way to keep couples bonded through hardship, but they were the minority. Most voices doubled down. Lust equals sin. Your body is suspect. Your thoughts are worse. And don't even think about touching yourself. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In certain regions, the church advised that married couples should abstain from sex for 40 days before Easter, 30 days before Christmas, 7 days before taking communion, and on all feast days, of which there were a lot. By the time you add in menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum periods and fasting seasons, the average medieval couple was left with about, 5 to 10 guilt-ridden, nervously performed nights per year. Max! And don't you dare enjoy them! Meanwhile, the same church that preached against lust in sermons funded illuminated manuscripts that showed Adam and Eve blushing under fig leaves, demons groping monks in their sleep, and even naked saints resisting temptation while naked. The mixed messaging is almost funny if it weren't so damaging. On one hand, sex is dangerous. On the other, look at these pictures of people almost having it. And the debate still simmers in academic circles. Some argue that medieval Christians internalized all this doctrine, living lives of repression and shame. Others suggest that people just nodded along in church and then went back to doing whatever they were going to do anyway. After all, there's no shortage of confessions, court records, and poetry filled with desire, scandal, and not-so-holy thoughts. Maybe people learned to live in both worlds, pious by day, passionate by night. Back in the church, the priest is winding down, his voice softening, as he calls for repentance. Guard your thoughts, he says, for they are the seeds of action. Even a single lustful glance can be the beginning of eternal damnation. You look around at the crowd again, and it's clear, no one here is entirely free of guilt. That's kind of the point. Keep them ashamed and they'll keep coming back, keep confessing, keep donating, keep believing. You slip out the side door as the choir begins to sing, voices echoing off stone in solemn harmonies. Outside, the sun is high and the street smells like life. Cooked onions, fresh bread, unwashed bodies and horses. You inhale deeply. The church may have tried to shame every human urge, but out here, people are still kissing, still loving, still sneaking behind haystacks. Next, you'll follow some of those forbidden glances into darker corners of society, where same-sex love flickered quietly, persistently, beneath the surface of a world that swore it didn't exist. The city narrows around you into quieter corners, alleys shadowed by tall stone buildings, spaces where eyes are less watchful and whispers travel farther than footsteps. You've left behind the sermons and the public punishments, slipped out of the town square where sin is loudly condemned, and into a realm of softer defiance. This is where the things no one dares to name still manage to survive. Same-sex love in the Middle Ages wasn't just forbidden, it was declared impossible. And yet, here you are, walking the same streets where it persisted anyway, stubborn as ivy growing between the cracks. You pass 2 young men seated beside a fountain, shoulders just barely touching. Their conversation is quiet, casual on the surface, but the way they look at each other speaks volumes. A moment too long, a smile too shy. No one would notice if they weren't looking closely. And that's the secret, isn't it? In a world that insists this love doesn't exist, the key to survival is not being seen, or being seen just enough to pass. The church's official stance was simple. Homosexuality was sodomy, and sodomy was a sin so grave it ranks just beneath heresy and witchcraft. Penalties ranged from public penance to mutilation, exile, or execution. But the church also failed to define it clearly. For all the fear-mongering, they didn't really understand what they were condemning. Was it desire? Was it action? Could two people of the same sex love each other without sinning? The ambiguity gave space for contradictions and for survival. Medieval legal records are scattered with cases that hint at a hidden world. A monk caught writing passionate letters to a fellow brother. A nun transferred after being too close with another sister. A city magistrate fined for hosting inappropriate entertainments in his private garden. One man was dragged before the court in Florence for embracing another in the manner of a lover. The record doesn't say what happened after. It rarely does, but not every story ends in punishment. In some corners of the medieval world, particularly in cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris, same-sex desire flourished under layers of denial and clever euphemism. You come across the word fraternitas, meaning brotherhood, used in records of unusually intense male friendships. In convents, amicitia, or spiritual friendship, was a popular term for deep, emotionally bonded relationships between women. Were these truly platonic? Maybe. Maybe not. But they offered a safe way to say, I love you, without drawing too much attention. One of the most remarkable examples you stumble upon is the case of John and William, two Englishmen from the 14th century who were arrested for living together as husband and husband. The record is thin, but it's clear they had some form of commitment. Shared property, shared bed, shared reputation. The authorities didn't quite know what to do with them. They were fined, released, and mostly left alone. An exception rather than a rule, but a sliver of light nonetheless. And then there's the poetry, so much of it hiding in plain sight. You find a Latin poem written by a monk to his beloved, filled with yearning that's too tender to be anything but romantic. When I see you, my heart is restless, he writes. When you leave, my soul retreats into silence. It's possible to read it as spiritual longing, but the way he describes the other man's mouth, his hands, his scent, makes it hard to ignore what's really going on. In another convent, a sister named Agnes wrote dozens of letters to a fellow nun, Beatrice. She called her my mirror, my delight, and the only place my soul finds rest. Their correspondence survives only because someone, likely a less sympathetic superior, copied them into a book of dangerous attachments, which ironically preserved their story. And here's a quirky detail for the night. In 14th century France, some men in same-sex relationships took part in mock weddings, complete with rings, vows, and even bride prices. These events were done in secret, often under cover of festivals or carnivals where rules were more fluid. Of course, if caught, they were condemned as blasphemers. But for that one night, they got to pretend. Even within the church, things weren't as black and white as the preachers claimed. Some monastic orders tolerated deep same-sex bonds, as long as they were expressed through letters or poetry and not, actually acted upon. The Brothers of the Common Life, for instance, encouraged emotional intimacy among male students as a form of spiritual brotherhood. Was that cover for something more? Possibly. Or maybe it was an attempt to carve out space where closeness wasn't instantly labelled as sin. That's the great scholarly debate, of course. Were these intense same-sex friendships truly romantic and erotic, or are modern readers projecting? Some historians argue that medieval people had different categories of love, and what looks romantic to us was just emotional closeness. Others say, come on, read the poems. These people were in love. They were just stuck in a society that didn't have the language or freedom to say it out loud. As you wander further, you realise that surviving meant becoming fluent in ambiguity. Same-sex love didn't announce itself. It slipped between the lines. It lived in coded glances, careful phrasing, and shared spaces that outsiders couldn't decode. In many ways, it was a kind of medieval queerness that anticipated everything to come. Resilient, adaptive, private but powerful. And for all the fear and silence, there was beauty too. You think of two men writing poems to each other by candlelight, their fingers stained with ink and trembling with emotion. Or two women walking side by side in a convent garden, their hands brushing, their voices low and warm. They may have been erased from history's spotlight, but they existed. They loved. and they found ways to keep that love alive, however fleetingly, however secretly. You leave the quiet back streets and rejoin the flow of city life. Bells ring in the distance, a market opens, life continues, louder now. But you carry that stillness with you, the knowledge that beneath the surface of all the sermons and sanctions there were always people reaching for each other in the dark. Next, you're heading straight into the world of legalised sin, brothels that paid taxes, courtesans who held court, and city councils that tried to regulate desire like it was just another public utility. You follow the scent before you see the street, perfumed with rosewater and sweat, incense and something muskier. It leads you to a narrow alley tucked behind the marketplace, where laughter spills out of open windows and silk curtains flutter like flirtatious glances. This isn't a hidden den of vice, quite the opposite. You've stepped into the red light district, medieval style, a neighbourhood designed not to hide lust but to manage it. Welcome to the world of sanctioned sin, where brothels were legal, regulated, and in some places subsidised by the city itself. It's not the lawless, secretive place you might expect. Brothels in the later Middle Ages were often clean, orderly, and oddly bureaucratic. The women wore specific clothing, often red hoods or belts, to identify their profession. The buildings were licensed by the city, inspected by officials, and sometimes owned by the municipality itself. In places like Vienna, Paris and London, city councils taxed the brothels and used the revenue to fund public works. You heard that right. Medieval Europe paved roads and built fountains with sex money. You wander through a brothel courtyard in southern France, where a few women are lounging in embroidered robes, sipping watered wine and swapping gossip. They spot you immediately. New face, curious eyes, bad at pretending you're here for business. One of them, a sharp-witted woman with auburn hair and a knowing smile, beckons you over. "You here for the tour or the sermon?" she teases. You get the sense she's said that to more priests than tourists. Her name is Evelyn. She's not just a worker, she's the unofficial boss, the madam. She negotiates with the tax collector, screens potential clients, and makes sure the women under her roof are paid and fed. No pimps, no thugs, just a system of controlled indulgence, crafted as much for public safety as for pleasure. And this isn't just tolerated, it's encouraged. The church's stance on prostitution was, in its way, disturbingly pragmatic. St. Augustine had claimed that without prostitution, lust would cause chaos. So better to contain it, the thinking went, like a fire kept in a hearth. The brothel became a pressure valve, a place for unmarried men to relieve temptation without corrupting good women. In Florence, there was even a city-funded brothel called the Casa delle Donne, where sex workers received meals, medical care and police protection in exchange for regular reports on their clients' behaviour. Of course, the reality wasn't so clean. While some women found independence and community within the system, others were forced into it, by poverty, coercion or family desperation. Girls as young as 12 were put to work under the guise of servants, only to be trained into the profession. Some were kidnapped, others were sold by their parents. Once inside, it wasn't easy to leave, especially if you had debts, or a child, or nowhere else to go. The line between sex work and slavery was often paper thin, and sometimes not even that. Aveline, your sharp-eyed guide, tells you as much without flinching. Some of us chose this, others didn't. Either way, it's work. Her voice is steady, not bitter, just resigned. Men come in looking for pleasure. We sell it like bread and wine. Doesn't mean we're empty. You look at the other women, laughing, card-playing, one napping with her feet propped on a barrel, and realise she's right. They have lives, stories, tempers and dreams. They're not vessels. They're people surviving a system that alternately punishes and profits off their bodies. And here's where it gets weird. In some towns, brothels were located right next to churches, literally side by side. You read about one Parisian priest who complained that the moaning from next door made it impossible to preach during evening mass. In another case, a bishop blessed a brothel after it reopened under new management, citing its importance to moral containment. You're not sure if that's hypocrisy or just medieval efficiency. Also, here's your quirky fact for the night. In London's Southwark, Wark district, sex workers employed a kind of early branding technique. They wore specific colour-coded gowns based on specialty, and their services were advertised through symbols, like a peacock feather in the window, or a boot tied to the door handle. You imagine what Yelp reviews would look like in 1387 and try not to laugh. Of course, regulation didn't mean protection. The same authorities who taxed brothels were quick to turn on them during moral panics. When plague swept through cities, prostitutes were often the first blamed. Some were expelled, others whipped publicly to cleanse the city, and while many clients came from the upper classes, the women bore all the consequences if caught. One girl in Avignon was executed for spreading syphilis, even though her most regular customer was a cardinal. Still, the system endured because it was useful. Brothels served a political purpose. They kept excess desire off the streets. They gave soldiers, merchants and clergy a discreet outlet. And perhaps most importantly, they were visible, manageable. If lust could be taxed and scheduled, maybe it wouldn't overflow into the homes of respectable citizens. Scholars are still debating how much agency medieval sex workers really had. Some argue that the brothel system was exploitative from top to bottom, a machine of control and shame. Others see moments of autonomy, women who rose to positions of power, ran their own establishments, or even retired with wealth and property. There are records of former prostitutes becoming respected landowners, midwives and even nuns. One particularly bold woman in Flanders sued a nobleman for breach of contract and won. Back in the brothel, Aveline shrugs off a question about retirement. Maybe one day I'll open a bakery, she says. Something sweet, something quiet. But for now, she's in charge here. And in a world that tries to own and silence women like her, that's no small thing. As you leave the district, the sound of music and laughter fades behind you. It's getting dark, but the lamps are lit. Life continues. Desire doesn't disappear just because it's labelled dangerous. Sometimes it just finds a price tag and a time slot. Next, you'll meet the women who refuse to be priced, categorised or silenced. Widows, rebels, mistresses, and those who decided they wanted more than society ever planned to give them. Not actually be her cousin. The two women share a home, a bed and a business. And while they never say aloud what they are to each other, the answer hums in the space between their words. They operate in that liminal zone where the village isn't quite sure what's going on, but no one dares ask. Joan smirks when you bring it up. I dye silk, she says, not explain myself. In a world where women were supposed to marry or retreat to a convent, she's chosen a third option, self-sufficiency. And then there are the mistresses. Often painted as sinful distractions or scandalous shadows in noble courts, they were far more complex than their reputation suggests. You find yourself at a manor house outside the city where a well-dressed woman named Isolde greets you in a garden that smells like lavender and clove. She's the long-time mistress of a wealthy baron, no secret, no shame. She has her own servants, her own rooms, and a pearl necklace that probably costs more than a peasant's farm. Isolde isn't a scorned woman, she's an institution. His wife manages the estate, she tells you, and I manage him. She chuckles, but there's truth in it. While noble marriages were often political, mistresses offered emotional intimacy, sensuality and companionship, things that didn't always survive arranged unions. Some wielded genuine power. Agnès Sorel, mistress of King Charles VII of France, had political influence and a say in court affairs. She also wore low-cut gowns that scandalised the church and set fashion trends across Europe. A mistress could shape culture and policy from a silk-draped chamber, just as effectively as a queen with a crown, but mistresses walked a fine line. Their power was always precarious, tied to the whims of the men who kept them. If their patron died, remarried or lost interest, they could be cast out overnight, richer than some, sure, but legally vulnerable. Many secured gifts of land or property, hoping to anchor their futures before their lovers moved on. Some succeeded, others vanished into the records, unnamed and unsupported. You also meet a few women who operated completely outside the formal systems, rebels in the truest sense. One is a healer named Tilda, who lives in a hut on the edge of the woods. She's not a witch, though plenty of people call her that. She grows herbs, treats wounds, and knows more about the human body than most city doctors. She's had lovers, she admits, both male and female, but doesn't keep them long. Too noisy, she says, rinsing roots in a copper bowl. I like silence better. Her autonomy comes at a cost. Constant suspicion. The church doesn't like women with knowledge. The men in town don't like a woman who doesn't need them. Tilda shrugs. Let them talk. And talk they do. The medieval world ran on gossip, and nothing drew tongues faster than a woman who refused to stay in her lane. A widow who didn't remarry. A weaver who drank alone at the tavern. A midwife who kept secrets. These women were either accused of sorcery, seduction, or, more subtly, being strange. You read case after case of women called to testify not for crimes, but for behaviour unbecoming a woman. Sometimes that meant swearing. Other times it meant walking alone after dark. One particularly memorable case involved a woman in Lübeck who wore trousers under her dress and was hauled before the council for masculine arrogance. Her defence? It's warmer. They find her anyway. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In a few regions, especially in late medieval Germany, women's guilds allowed single or widowed women to join as full members and even vote on business decisions. In one town, a female-led brewing guild dominated the local beer market for decades. They brewed, they profited, they enforced quality standards with a kind of delightful ferocity. One document refers to them as the Hop Sisters. If the men complained, the women raised the prices. These stories challenge the tired narrative that medieval women were all docile, silent, or confined to marriage. They weren't. Many were loud, resourceful, strategic. They moved through systems meant to limit them, and found cracks to slip through. Some climbed, some barged. Some, like Joan and Tilda and Marjorie, simply stepped aside and built new paths entirely. But scholars still debate just how free these women really were. Some argue their autonomy was always on a knife's edge, easily revoked if they stepped too far out of line. Others point to evidence of lasting influence. Women who left wills, ran estates, and wrote letters that reshaped family fortunes. You can almost hear the tension in the sources. Were these women exceptions or proof that the rules were never as rigid as they seemed? As you leave Marjorie's cottage, the street glows in the early evening light. The girl passes by carrying a bundle of herbs. A merchant's wife barks orders at a servant. Two older women sit on a stoop gossiping about a neighbour who smiles too easily. Life continues, full of contradictions. Women in the Middle Ages were saints, sinners, wives, widows, mothers, witches, rulers, rebels, and often all of those at once. Next you'll run your hands across fabrics that do more than keep people warm, silks and furs that seduce, conceal, and reveal. Because when everyone says desire is sinful, even clothing becomes part of the game. You run your fingers along a bolt of fabric draped across a merchant's table, deep crimson velvet, smooth as sin. Even in the noisy bustle of the market, surrounded by clanging bells and shouting vendors, this cloth seems to hum with silent suggestion. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying warm or showing status. It was seduction, armour, manipulation, sometimes all at once. It whispered things no mouth dared speak. Because when the church preached modesty and restraint, people did what they always do. They got creative. The merchant waves you over, eager to show off his imported goods. He holds up a length of fine Italian silk, dyed blue with crushed lapis and thin as breath. It catches the light, shimmer slipping over its surface like water. For noble ladies, he says, but you can tell it's not meant to cover much. In the upper classes, layers of gauze and silk weren't just luxuries, they were strategic distractions. A neckline that dipped just far enough, a sleeve that clung to the curve of a wrist, a hem that lifted a little too high in motion. Skin was always a flicker away. Sumptuary laws, those fancy words for clothing restrictions, were supposed to stop this. Issued by the church and secular authorities alike, they dictated who could wear what. Commoners couldn't wear velvet. Prostitutes had to wear specific colours. No woman could wear pearls unless her husband earned a certain income. And no one, not even queens, was supposed to show too much flesh. Naturally, everyone ignored these laws or found clever ways around them. You see a woman passing by in a gown that hugs her hips a little too closely, the lacing along her back deliberately tight. Her head is covered, yes, because modesty, but her hair peeks out in golden curls from beneath her veil. That's intentional. In fact, hair itself was considered wildly erotic. Theologians wrote treatises about it. St. Paul said women should keep it covered, lest they tempt men into sin. But behind closed doors, hair was unbound, brushed, scented, and displayed for lovers like a personal striptease. Then there are the shoes. Oh, the shoes. In the late Middle Ages, men wore poulaines, long, pointed shoes that stretched several inches past the toes, curving up like a wink. The church hated them, called them prideful, sinful, obscene. Why? Because the longer your shoes, the richer, and therefore more sexually suspect, you appeared. In some regions, the points were rumoured to indicate the size of another protrusion. You try not to laugh, but the logic is deliciously absurd. Women had their own tricks, fitted bodices, side lacing that accentuated the waist, cloaks that could be pulled closed or left open just enough. Even the smell of clothing mattered. Garments were often infused with herbs, rose, lavender, frankincense, scented signals that said I'm clean, I'm wealthy, or sometimes I'm ready. There were no Chanel counters, but the effect was the same. Smell, texture, colour, each a code. The church, of course, panicked. Over and over, sermons warned that rich fabrics led men to sin, and women who dressed too finely were temptresses of the devil. One preacher warned that silk clung to the body like Satan to a soul. Another said fur-lined sleeves were like velvet paths to hell. You wonder if he ever touched one. And here's a quirky fact for the night. Some medieval men wore codpieces, little fabric pouches at the front of their hose, not just to protect themselves, but to exaggerate what they had. Early on they were functional, but by the 15th century they'd grown ambitious, padded, stuffed, embroidered. Some were shaped like literal animal heads or held open like flower petals. One even had a tiny dagger sewn to it, for no discernible reason except maybe overcompensation. The codpiece became such a symbol of masculine virility that scholars today still debate whether it was more about sex or status, or both. A knight in a well-fitted doublet with an oversized codpiece wasn't just saying I'm a warrior, he was also saying I have heirs. And possibly I have syphilis, since some were designed to hold medicated cloths for infected men. But let's not ruin the fantasy just yet. Meanwhile, in courtly circles, fashion turned into foreplay. Lovers would give each other clothing tokens, a glove, a ribbon, a sleeve. These weren't just sentimental, they were invitations. A ribbon worn on the arm signalled devotion, a dropped handkerchief could launch a scandal. You read one love poem where a man spends 10 lines describing the texture of a woman's stocking before ever mentioning her face. Clothes made the body visible and hidden at once, a game of suggestion and denial. Not all messages were private. In some places, clothing became political. During the 100 Years' War, English women were forbidden from wearing French styles, a subtle way of aligning loyalty with morality. To wear the wrong cut or fabric was considered almost treasonous, as if lace could betray a kingdom. You find yourself staring at a gown in a tailor's shop, green velvet laced up the front with slits at the sleeves that let the linen underdress puff out like clouds. It's sensual without being vulgar, expensive without being loud. You can see a noblewoman wearing this at court, carefully not spilling her wine, smiling just enough at her rival's husband. She knows what she's doing. Fashion in this world is not frivolous. It's strategy, it's language. And yet the rules still hung heavy. A woman who dressed too finely could be called vain. A man who wore soft fabrics could be mocked as effeminate. Gender norms were as stitched into clothing as the embroidery. One record from London shows a man arrested for wearing a woman's cloak and acting coy. He was fined and forced to parade through the city in drag while being pelted with dung. It wasn't just about fabric, it was about keeping everyone in their place. Scholars still argue over whether these fashions liberated or constrained. Did they let people express secret desires through symbols, or did they just wrap lust in another layer of social expectation? Like so much in the Middle Ages, the answer lies in the tension. People wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to be desired, and when speech failed, fabric spoke for them. As you leave the market, the wind lifts the edge of your cloak, and a passing man glances. Too long, too bold, you ignore it, but the message is clear. You're part of the game now. Dressed or undressed, you carry the story of your body wherever you go. Next, you'll enter the dreamscape, where demons take lovers' shapes. Saints writhe in visions, and lust is explained away by the supernatural. It's time to meet the creatures medieval people blamed for everything that happened in the dark. The night falls heavier here, darker than any you've known in this journey so far. You're no longer in the courtly gardens or the bustling brothel alleys. Now you walk through a village smothered in silence, shutters bolted tight, candles snuffed out early. Even the dogs are quiet. The fear here isn't of thieves or sickness, it's of what visits in the night. You're entering the world of medieval demons, where desire and dread twist together in fevered dreams, and where succubi and incubi wait just beyond the reach of the candlelight. You hear about it first from a shepherd who crosses himself 3 times before he speaks. She said it came through the wall, he mutters. Took her in her sleep. Looked like her husband, but with burning eyes. The woman he's talking about hasn't left her bed in days. She won't speak, just stares. The priest says she's been touched by the devil. The midwife whispers that she's had a visitation. No one says what they really think, that she had a dream so vivid it shook her body, and her soul. In the medieval mind, lust that arrived uninvited, inexplicable, especially in dreams or between sleep and wakefulness, had to come from outside. It couldn't be the self. It had to be a demon. And so the incubus and succubus were born, shape-shifting spirits who slipped into your bed when your defences were down. The incubus male assaulted women, the succubus female preyed on men, though to be honest the rules got fuzzy pretty fast. Some demons apparently didn't care about gender, some switched forms, some took on the shapes of lost lovers or dead spouses, easing their way into dreams with familiarity, then taking what they wanted. You flip through a dusty copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, that charming 15th century witch-hunting manual, and find entire chapters dedicated to demonic lust. The authors, 2 fanatical inquisitors, claim demons collected semen from sleeping men and used it to impregnate women. Stealing seed became their explanation for untraceable pregnancies, nocturnal emissions, and even homosexual encounters. It was, in their minds, a logical system of infernal reproduction. Totally scientific, completely insane. But the fear was real. People believed their dreams were not private. If you woke up flushed, panting, or with signs of arousal, you could be accused of inviting demonic activity, even if you swore you were asleep. For women especially, it was a double bind. Admitting to arousal meant danger. Denying it, if someone else suspected, could lead to punishment. In some convents, nuns reported visions of devils with warm breath and fingers like flame. Others claimed to see beautiful men who whispered Latin and kissed their necks as they recited psalms. You think about how lonely those cloisters must have been, and how easy it is for suppressed longing to wear the mask of a nightmare. Not everyone feared the demons, though. Some tales read suspiciously like fan fiction. One woman in Milan was put on trial for claiming she willingly slept with a demon who appeared as a dark-haired knight. She described the encounter in scandalous detail. His eyes, his voice, the way he moved like smoke. The court condemned her as a heretic, of course, but you can't help wondering if she'd just found a clever, dangerous way to talk about her desires. If society gives you no safe language for wanting, you borrow the devil's. The church naturally leaned into the horror. Preachers gave long, terrifying sermons about lustful spirits that waited for the careless. They warned that masturbation summoned succubi, that dreams of sex opened your soul to possession, that pleasure without purpose was a doorway to damnation. They described demonic lovers who left claw marks, sucked the life from you, made your limbs heavy and your mind foggy. You read one priest's account of a nun who bled from the thighs and confessed to nightly ravishment. He doesn't ask if she was sick or lonely. He calls her marked by hell. But here's the quirky twist. Some medical writers didn't blame demons at all. They thought it was just bad digestion. Yes, really. In certain medical texts, particularly from the Islamic world, and later translated to Latin, nighttime emissions and erotic dreams were said to be caused by vapours rising from the stomach to the brain. The solution? Better food, fewer onions, maybe a laxative, which honestly is kind of refreshing. The open scholarly debate, though, is about what all this meant socially. Were demon lovers just metaphors for sexual repression? Were they a scapegoat for trauma, desire, or consensual acts turned scandalous? Some argue they were a cultural coping mechanism, a way to make sense of a body that betrayed you in sleep, or emotions too volatile to name. Others believe that these visions and visitations were, at least in part, performative. Stories designed to satisfy both the confessor and the confessor's audience, whether that be a priest, a judge, or a crowd hungry for lurid details. You climb a narrow staircase into the attic of a forgotten priory and find a manuscript filled with scribbled prayers. In the margin, a monk has drawn what appears to be a woman with wings, kneeling on a man's chest. Above her is a Latin phrase, Domina Somniorum, Lady of Dreams. You stare at it longer than you mean to. The lines are shaky but intentional, tender even. It doesn't look like a warning. It looks like longing. And that's what lingers as you walk back down into the cool air outside, the sense that for all the fear, there was fascination. that the line between fear and fantasy was thin and easily crossed. In a world that declared desire monstrous, people didn't stop wanting. They just gave their hunger horns and wings and said it came in the night. You turn onto a road leading away from the village, past a shrine where someone's left a candle burning low. The night is quiet, but you wonder who will dream of whom before morning, and what they'll say about it when the sun comes up. Next, you'll flip through pages of early medical guides and anatomy texts. Because when it came to sex, the so-called experts had ideas. Some brilliant, some ridiculous, all deeply medieval. You find yourself in a cramped stone chamber that smells like dried herbs, burnt parchment, and a trace of something sour, possibly regret. A massive book lies open on the table before you, its vellum pages smudged with ink and oily fingerprints. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where sex and science shared a very awkward bed. The physicians of the time weren't just trying to cure plague or diagnose fevers. They were also deeply invested in figuring out what your genitals were up to and why they wouldn't behave themselves. You begin reading one of the most famous texts of the era, De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women. The title sounds mysterious and kind of poetic until you realise it's mostly a weird mix of anatomy, theology, astrology and total nonsense. According to this text, a woman could conceive only if she orgasmed. Yes. Medieval medical wisdom stated that female pleasure was not only natural, it was necessary, which honestly sounds progressive until you remember that it meant that pregnancy was proof of female desire. So if a woman claimed rape, the fact that she conceived was considered evidence that she must have enjoyed it. Nightmare logic. This belief came from a blend of ancient sources like Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through a fog of mistranslation and Christian paranoia. Galen, for example, believed that male and female bodies were essentially the same, except women were turned inside out. Testicles became ovaries. The penis became the vagina. It was all a matter of heat and moisture. Men were hotter and drier, therefore superior. Women were cold and wet, therefore unstable, emotional, and frankly, it's a bit leaky. You flip to an anatomical drawing of a woman, and it's mostly guesswork. No nerves, no clear reproductive system, just a kind of mysterious hollow tunnel leading to a vaguely defined womb shaped like a wine flask. Next to it, a caption reads, "The uterus has 7 chambers, 3 for boys, 3 for girls, and 1 for monsters." You blink. Monsters. Yes, apparently the 7th chamber could produce changelings, freaks, or demons, depending on the alignment of the stars and how much garlic the mother had consumed. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. Still, there was a logic to their madness. Medieval physicians believed in the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These governed everything from your temperament to your sex life. Too much blood? You were lustful and rash. Too much black bile? Melancholy? Probably celibate. Sexual desire, they believed, was caused by excess heat. That's why women were often considered more sexual than men. They were thought to store more internal moisture, which built up pressure and needed release. So yes, in some texts, female masturbation was actually recommended as a form of treatment. Better to spill than to swell, wrote one medical friar, and if that isn't the tagline for an herbal supplement, it should be. But while the theory suggested women had stronger sexual appetites, socially, this was a ticking bomb. A woman who was too lusty was seen as dangerous, unnatural. There were endless debates about how to control female desire. Cold baths, chastity belts, heavy diets of lentils and vinegar. One guide recommended wearing rough woolen garments to discourage the senses. Another suggested keeping women occupied with embroidery to avoid idle and wandering thoughts. You picture a nun stitching flowers into linen while thinking about the monk who smiled at her yesterday, and wonder how effective that really was. Men didn't get off much easier. While male sexuality was assumed, and even encouraged, especially for producing heirs, there was still a lot of panic around when and how it was expressed. Nocturnal emissions were a big concern. Pollution, they called it. Some doctors believed it weakened the heart and clouded the mind. Others warned that it opened the body to demonic infiltration. One poor student in Paris reportedly confessed to ejaculating in sleep thrice weekly, and was told to fast, pray, and sleep on hard boards until the devil left his loins. You find a particularly bizarre passage in a physician's notebook explaining how to determine if a woman was a virgin. According to him, you should examine her urine, watch her walk, and see whether she laughs too easily. Virgins, he wrote, walk upright, laugh modestly, and hold their eyes downcast. If she looks you in the eye, probably not a virgin. If she laughs loudly, definitely not. If she limps, who knows? And here's your quirky fact of the night. Some medieval sex manuals included recipes for aphrodisiacs involving ingredients like roasted ants, powdered vulture liver, and wine mixed with goat testicle. One particularly potent potion claimed to inflame the loins and soften the heart. Side effects? Probably death, but they never mentioned that part. Other advice included rubbing nettle oil on your thighs, or sleeping with an apple under your pillow and eating it in the morning to absorb the dreams of love. Despite the absurdities, not all of it was fantasy. Some early texts recognised the clitoris, though often misunderstood it. There were diagrams, however rudimentary, that acknowledged female pleasure. Midwives, more grounded than the male physicians, kept oral knowledge about birth, menstruation and reproductive health that actually worked. It's just that their wisdom rarely got written down, unless a man overheard and claimed it as his own. Scholars today argue over how seriously these manuals were taken. Some say they were academic exercises, more philosophical than practical. Others believe they were used like early health guides, read in monasteries, passed around university libraries, consulted by midwives and apothecaries alike. What's certain is that they reflect a culture obsessed with regulating sex, understanding sex, and completely failing to do either. As you close the book, your head is swimming with images, ink-stained fingers, misunderstood anatomy, priests scribbling about lust with the intensity of poets. It's clear that even the experts weren't immune to curiosity, or arousal, or confusion, and when knowledge fell short, they filled the gaps with myth, metaphor, and just enough Latin to make it sound official. You step out into the daylight, blinking. Somewhere nearby, a couple is arguing over a bundle of herbs. A midwife scolds a child for throwing a turnip. Life moves on. The human body, with all its mystery and madness, keeps doing what it does. And next, you'll follow it far from home, onto ships and dusty roads, where holy men forget their vows, and pilgrims stumble into temptation in foreign lands. You wake to the creak of wagon wheels and the low chant of a pilgrim's hymn echoing off the dusty road. The sun is already brutal, the horizon shimmering in heat as you join a stream of travellers making their way towards something sacred, or at least officially sacred. This is a crusade route, a pilgrimage path, a ribbon of devout feet and tired bodies stretching from Europe into the Holy Land, or toward Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome. And while everyone here claims they're walking for their souls, the reality, of course, is much messier. You're about to learn that piety and libido are far more travel companions than anyone wants to admit. You first fall in step beside a monk, brown robe, sandals worn smooth, eyes fixed on the path ahead. He tells you he's taken vows, poverty, obedience, chastity, but his voice cracks a bit on that last one. It's different out here, he mumbles, looking away. On the road. You've heard that before. Pilgrimage, with all its spiritual baggage, also brought anonymity, new towns, no relatives watching, and in many cases, no real oversight, which means that people who left home to purify themselves often found themselves neck deep in the very sins they claimed to flee. In one roadside tavern, you witness a knight drinking heavily, boasting that he's taking the cross, but his hand is firmly planted on a barmaid's thigh. Nearby, two supposed pilgrims play dice for a girl's scarf, possibly stolen, definitely scented. These travellers aren't all holy. Many are bored. Some are broke. More than a few are looking for redemption in the same place they're also looking for flesh. A surprising number find both in the same bed. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. Towns along pilgrimage routes had entire economies built around servicing the bodies of pilgrims, not just feeding and housing them, but offering companionship of a less than holy nature. Temporary brothels popped up like mushrooms along the trail. Some were disguised as bathhouses, others didn't bother pretending. And in Jerusalem itself, crusaders were famously accompanied by a retinue of camp followers, many of them sex workers who marched just behind the banners of the cross. In fact, when King Richard the Lionheart led his crusade to the Holy Land, he didn't just bring knights, he brought women, a lot of women. Some were noble companions, others were washerwomen, the preferred euphemism for travelling lovers, paid or not. Church leaders huffed and puffed, of course, but nothing much changed. Crusades were months, even years long. Men wanted release, women wanted protection, food, or sometimes just the chance to escape their pasts. Sex wasn't the exception on these journeys. It was routine. You flip through a soldier's diary, carefully preserved in a German abbey, and find an entry that reads, "We prayed at the tomb of Christ, and after I lay with a girl from Acre. She smiled as if I had blessed her." It's not regret, it's remembrance, and it tells you everything. The holy mingle with the profane so thoroughly that sometimes even the pilgrims couldn't tell the difference. And it wasn't just straight-laced knights falling into temptation. Monks and priests travelled too, and many saw pilgrimage as a loophole. Far from their bishops, their abbots, their parishioners, they could sin quietly and return repentant. One friar from Avignon was known to travel with a cousin who mysteriously resembled a young novitiate in a borrowed dress. They switched roles in different towns. He heard confessions, she caused them, and here's a fringe fact you'll wish wasn't true. In some cases, brothels along pilgrimage routes operated with church protection. In exchange for regular donations or strategic silence, certain orders looked the other way. A few even collected penance fees from pilgrims who confessed to visiting these places, then turned around and collected taxes from the establishments themselves. That's medieval capitalism at its finest. But it wasn't always transactional. On the road, emotions ran high. You meet a woman named Beatrice, a weaver from Valencia who claims she fell in love with a Breton pilgrim somewhere outside Genoa. He said he'd write, she shrugs, but letters don't walk. She doesn't seem angry, just wistful. Her voice catches the little when she says his name. Love bloomed between mud and prayer, and sometimes it lasted only a few nights. Sometimes that's all it was meant to be. Still, for women, pilgrimage was a mixed blessing. Travelling alone could brand them as suspicious, vulnerable, or worse, available. One group of German nuns was famously attacked en route to Rome by a band of fellow pilgrims who turned out to be ex-soldiers with less spiritual intentions. Yet despite the risk, many women still made the journey, sometimes disguising themselves as men, sometimes banding together in groups. They carried relics and fear in equal measure. And then there's the tale of Maria of Brabant, who wrote about her travels in a now-lost letter. Copies survived in a convent archive. In it, she describes seeing men bathing naked in the Jordan River and feeling the fire of shame and curiosity in equal measure. She never touched anyone, but her language burns with desire. She ends the letter, "I did not sin, but I was not holy either." You wish you could have met her. Of course, not everyone returned home unchanged. Some brought back relics, others brought back children. More than one noble family quietly raised a pilgrim's son whose father's name was never written down. A few of these children were claimed openly. More were passed off as nephews, wards, or miracles. The road left marks that couldn't be confessed away. Scholars today argue whether these journeys were spiritual tests or excuses to cut loose. The truth lies in the middle, as always. For every devout pilgrim crawling barefoot toward a shrine, there was another stopping off at an inn, buying a drink, and finding comfort in the arms of someone who understood what it meant to be far from home. As the sun sets on the winding road, the songs of travellers rise in a messy chorus. Some sing of saints, others of lovers. You see a monk with a woman at his side, their fingers brushing, a quiet story forming between them. And you know the journey isn't just about reaching a shrine, it's about everything that happens along the way. Next, you'll take a bite of forbidden fruit. Herbs, elixirs, and magical concoctions said to stir the loins, bend wills, or cure a cold. Love potions, aphrodisiacs, and the dangerous art of making someone want you. You open the door to an apothecary shop and immediately feel like you've stepped into a sorcerer's pantry. The smell's overwhelming. An aggressive bouquet of lavender, mouldy rose petals, bitter wormwood, and something vaguely animal. Glass jars line every shelf, filled with pickled roots, dried mushrooms, crushed beetles, and powders in shades you're not sure nature intended. In the back, a woman with ink-stained fingers is hunched over a mortar, grinding something that smells like rotting oranges and cloves. She looks up with the faint smile of someone who knows things you probably shouldn't ask about. "Looking for something special?" she says. "To cure or to cause? Welcome to the world of medieval aphrodisiacs and love potions, where desire could be coaxed from a bottle, attraction stirred into a brew, and heartbreak cured with just the right powder, tucked into a lover's wine. In a time when open talk of sex was dangerous, people turned to plants, superstition, and a dash of kitchen witchery to get what they wanted, without ever saying it out loud. She shows you a bundle of dried yarrow tied with red thread. "Boil this," she says, "and have him drink it before dusk. If his eyes linger on your lips afterward, it worked." Yarrow was believed to stimulate desire, especially when paired with honey and red wine. Another shelf holds crushed cantharides, Spanish fly, made from blister beetles, dried and powdered. Highly toxic, of course, but in small enough amounts it was said to cause genital swelling and a fevered need for release, or death. It was a fine line, honestly. There's a jar labelled monk's breath. Inside, dried parsley and powdered gallingali. You're told it's good for cooling an overactive libido, given by cautious wives to pious husbands or nervous nuns to themselves. Nearby, a small vial marked with a crude heart shape holds an infusion of mandrake root. This one's famous, mandrake, with its vaguely human shape and eerie shriek when pulled from the ground, was said to stoke passion and create an almost mystical hunger. It was also rumoured to grow beneath gallows, nourished by the final emissions of hanged men. Romantic, no? And it wasn't all about seduction. Some potions were meant for revenge. You find one recipe titled "To Sour a Man's Blood." The ingredients? Mustard seed, sour wine, grave dirt, and fingernail clippings. Women would slip a few drops into a lover's drink to make him weak, less aggressive, or, in some cases, impotent. Whether it worked or not didn't matter. The belief did. Still, most of these concoctions weren't evil or malicious. They were just hopeful. In a world where marriages were arranged, options limited, and desire often dangerous, people reached for control wherever they could find it. A girl with no dowry might try a love charm to catch a merchant's eye. A young man too shy to speak might wear a bag of rosemary and a nace sewn into his shirt, praying the scent would give him confidence. Every herb had meaning, every blend a story. You learn that garlic rubbed on the thighs was thought to bring heat to the loins. Nutmeg, powdered and sprinkled on wine, was believed to loosen tongues and tighten bedsheets. Fennel, when worn in a locket, could repel unwanted attention, which feels like the medieval version of ghosting. There's even a practice where lovers wrote each other's names on bay leaves, tied them to their ankles, and danced under the moon to ensure fidelity. The ritual ends with burning the leaves. If the flame crackles, your love is true. If it hisses, someone's cheating. But not all love magic was herbal. There were prayers, incantations, and talismans too. One common charm involved writing the names of the three magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, on a piece of parchment and hiding it in your lover's shoe. Supposedly, this would make them dream of you and wake up with their heart tilted in your direction. Another involved pressing a blessed coin to the tongue and whispering your beloved's name 9 times. If they looked at you before sunset, the spell had worked. And here's your odd fact for the night. In some rural regions of Eastern Europe, villagers believed that semen collected from a linen bedsheet, yes, collected, could be used to create a love salve when mixed with rose oil and ground bees. The concoction, rubbed on the lips and wrists, supposedly made one irresistible. You try not to gag. The desperation is palpable, but also kind of poetic. People were willing to believe in anything if it meant being wanted. Of course, the church hated all of this. Love magic was considered a form of sorcery. Aphrodisiacs, especially those that worked without consent, bordered on demonic. Women caught making love charms could be charged with witchcraft. One woman in 1327 was accused of causing a man's unnatural fixation by boiling a love root in goat milk under the new moon. Her punishment? Flogging and exile. The man got a sermon and a slap on the wrist, but people didn't stop, they just got quieter. Recipes passed from mother to daughter, lover to lover, hidden in cookbooks between soup instructions or scribbled in margins of medical texts. Some wore their charms in hair braids, others stitched them into the hems of dresses. If you were clever, no one ever knew. Historians still debate how seriously to take these recipes. Were they actual attempts at chemistry, emotional placebos, or just rituals, little acts of control in a world full of uncertainty? Probably all three. What's certain is that the desire to influence love, to stir lust, to protect or provoke the heart, was as real as any miracle claimed from a saint's shrine. As you leave the apothecary, a girl with a basket slips past you, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear. She looks back just once to see if anyone noticed. You did, and maybe someone else will too. Next, you'll climb the steps of castles and courtrooms to see how marriage and power twisted together, where monogamy was preached, but political alliances often came with side flings, concubines and expectations that had little to do with love. You're in the great hall of a stone castle now, under a ceiling so high it seems more concerned with impressing God than keeping the heat in. Tapestries line the walls, scenes of hunts, battles, and noble weddings where no one looks particularly happy. The lord and lady sit on their thrones, surrounded by attendants, stewards, and not a single romantic spark. You're watching a marriage that's less about vows and more about assets. Because in medieval Europe, love rarely had anything to do with who stood beside you at the altar. Marriage was strategy, lust. That came later, if it came at all. You study the couple. She's 17 and freshly imported from a rival barony. Her dowry includes 2 vineyards and a corner of disputed forest. He's 34, with thinning hair and a reputation for gambling. Their union was arranged when she was still a child, sealed with a signature and a goblet of wine, not whispers in the dark. You can feel the chill between them even now, despite the fire crackling at their feet. Monogamy was the church's official stance, of course. One man, one woman, joined under God with no room for wandering eyes or hands, but that rule was applied unevenly at best. For nobles and royals, marriage was a tool, a political contract, an alliance brokered in bloodlines and land. Everyone expected a husband to have mistresses. Everyone expected a wife to look the other way. Fidelity was a virtue, not a requirement. You recall the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. Their marriage was an unqualified disaster, politically and sexually. She was sharp-tongued and confident. He was devout, awkward, and barely interested. They produced 2 daughters, no sons, and after years of frosty silences, she had the marriage annulled. Her next husband, Henry II of England. They had 8 children, at least 2 legendary affairs, and enough marital dysfunction to fuel a Shakespeare cycle. Monogamy clearly was flexible, but while kings and lords had room to roam, women didn't. A wife caught in adultery could lose her title, her land, even her life. In some regions, an unfaithful noblewoman was imprisoned or forced into a convent. One duchess in Brittany was sewn into a sack and drowned for a rumoured affair with a knight. Her lover? Flogged, mildly, then reassigned to a post in the countryside, justice medieval style. Not all powerful women accepted this quietly. You read about a Castilian queen who kept her own lovers and dared anyone to challenge her. One of them, a poet, wrote that she touched him like a lioness and ruled him like a king. She wasn't punished. Her bloodline was too valuable, but her name was scrubbed from several court records, as if desire itself were something you could redact. It wasn't just nobility playing the game. Wealthy merchants in cities like Florence and Bruges also arranged marriages for profit. Their wives were expected to be silent, fertile, and dressed appropriately. One record shows a man fining his wife 10 silver coins for wearing green silk without prior approval. Another forbade his spouse from singing during supper because it was too joyful for a matron. Meanwhile, the same men kept courtesans on stipends and visited brothels under the guise of business meetings. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In 14th century Italy, there was a custom called friari, where noblemen arranged for their wives to have social companions, younger men, often poets or musicians, who were allowed to escort them to events, flatter them, and even share private moments. Officially, it was all very platonic. Unofficially, well, the husbands weren't exactly checking in every night. Some of these companions ended up in the wives' wills or in anonymous poetry that never quite died out. The church kept trying to intervene. Bishops preached that marriage was sacred, and any deviation from it would lead to eternal damnation or, worse, scandal. Priests gave sermons on the sanctity of the marriage bed. But they rarely called out powerful men. The rules were strict for peasants, enforced for commoners, and optional for anyone with a title. You start to realise that medieval monogamy was more about managing appearances than managing desire. Even the marriage ceremony itself had multiple versions. The church preferred marriages to happen before a priest, with witnesses and vows. But plenty of unions were sealed with nothing more than a verbal promise and a roll in the hay. Canon law eventually recognised these so-called clandestine marriages if they met certain criteria: mutual consent and consummation. In one famous case, a woman proved her marriage by producing the stained sheets, not from the wedding night, from a week before, behind a barn. Divorce in the modern sense didn't exist. Annulments did, but they were expensive and required a good excuse, usually consanguinity, turns out you were cousins, impotence, or evidence the marriage hadn't been consummated. Some couples faked these things to escape unhappy pairings. One man even hired a friend to testify that his wife smelled so foul it prevented intimacy. She claimed he simply didn't know what he was doing. The court ruled in her favour. Polygamy, officially banned, still made shadow appearances. Kings took concubines. Nobles kept unofficial second wives. In some cases, especially in border regions or among crusaders far from home, men had temporary wives, women they lived with, fathered children with, and then abandoned when they returned. The church occasionally tried to legitimize these unions or baptize the children, but mostly they were just brushed under the velvet rug of political expediency. Scholars still argue over whether medieval people believed in romantic love within marriage. Some did. You read letters between noble spouses filled with real affection. One knight wrote to his wife, "Your absence wounds me like a blade, and your letters are my only bandage." Sweet, right? But they were the exception and not the rule. Most marriages were work, strategic, public, controlled. As you leave the hall, the newlyweds are nowhere to be seen. Upstairs, their bedding is probably being watched by the chaperones with wine breath and high expectations. Whether they find desire or just duty tonight, no one seems to care. The alliance is made, the land is secured, the rest is details. Next, you'll sneak down into the cellar of lineage, the place where illegitimate children were born, hidden, claimed, or cast aside. Because nothing complicates medieval sex more than a baby born in the wrong bed. The hallway is narrow, the candles low. You follow a midwife down a winding back stair, past the sleeping nobles and polished halls of a manor house that pretends everything is perfectly in order. But below the grandeur, secrets swell like mildew behind fine tapestries. You step into a chamber tucked behind the kitchens, where a fire crackles and a woman cries softly into a wool blanket. She's just given birth, and from the looks exchanged between the midwife and the nursemaid, this child won't be celebrated. It wasn't born of marriage, it wasn't expected, and it's not entirely welcome. Illegitimate children in medieval society lived at the jagged edge of propriety. Sometimes protected, sometimes punished, always precarious. Everything depended on who your parents were and how willing they were to admit what happened in the dark. This baby, red-faced and squalling, is the daughter of a nobleman and a servant girl. He'll never publicly acknowledge her. He already has a legitimate heir upstairs, plump and rosy and watched by 4 nurses. But he might offer a purse of coins to the mother, a cradle, maybe a place in a convent when she's old enough, or maybe not. Sometimes the girls were sent away to foster homes, or taken in by nuns, raised as orphans with suspiciously generous dowries. Other times they were left at church doors with only a note and a whispered prayer. Among peasants, things were both simpler and harsher. A child born out of wedlock meant shame, yes, but it also meant fewer consequences, unless the father refused to claim responsibility. Bastardy fines existed in many villages. The man paid a small fee and the woman performed penance, often publicly, barefoot in church. But even in smaller communities, rumours had weight. A girl with a child and no husband became unmarriageable. Her options? Beg, work, or hope a wandering friar took mercy. In the noble class, illegitimacy was an open secret with elaborate etiquette. Kings had official mistresses, complete with households, titles, and children who were raised just a rung or two below the legitimate heirs. You read about Charles II of Navarre, who installed his favourite mistress in a tower near the castle, and sent his own wife letters filled with polite apologies and zero intention of ending the affair. Their children were educated, given land, sometimes even entered the clergy or married minor nobility. Some of these royal bastards became powerful figures in their own right. William the Conqueror, yes, that William, was famously known as William the Bastard before he took England by storm in 1066. His illegitimacy didn't stop him. In fact, he wore the insult like armour. Others weren't so lucky. Illegitimate sons could be barred from inheritance, denied titles, or forced into the church whether they wanted it or not. Women fared even worse. A nobleman's bastard daughter might be married off to a minor knight or sent to a nunnery, If she was exceptionally beautiful, she might follow in her mother's footsteps and become someone else's mistress. But love was rarely part of the equation. Legitimacy shaped futures, and the stain of being born on the wrong side of the sheets could last a lifetime. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 13th century England, there was an actual legal term, filius nullius, used in court to refer to an illegitimate child. It means son of no one. Imagine being addressed like that in front of your neighbours. It wasn't just social, it was legal erasure. Bastards couldn't inherit unless formally legitimised by royal decree or papal blessing. And yes, people paid a lot to get those. Still, some tried to game the system. You come across a forged marriage document, crude handwriting, a fake priest's name. The nobleman used it to claim his mistress had actually been his secret wife all along, thereby making their son legitimate. The ruse lasted 6 months before the real priest turned up and ruined everything. The son was stripped of inheritance, and the mistress mysteriously died during illness. You don't ask questions. Sometimes the opposite happened. Lovers married after the child was born, hoping that a post-facto wedding would clean things up. Canon law had debates about this for centuries. Could marriage retroactively legitimise children? The answer changed depending on which pope you asked. Some said yes, others absolutely not. Scholars still argue whether these shifting rules were acts of mercy, or just a cynical way to control inheritance and keep power in the right hands. But not every story ends in tragedy. You meet a boy named Thomas, born of a merchant and his seamstress mistress. The father never married the mother, but he paid for Thomas's education and apprenticed him to a scribe. Now grown, Thomas writes contracts for land deals and has the neatest penmanship in the county. He's not nobility, he'll never inherit a manor, but he's respected, clean-clothed and fully aware of where he came from. My mother gave me her name, he says, and my father gave me his coin. That's enough. You realise that for many, survival meant finding power in the margins. Bastards weren't necessarily doomed, they were just uninvited to the table. Some found ways to climb in through the side door. Others built new tables entirely. There's an open, scholarly debate about how widespread social mobility really was for illegitimate children. Were exceptions like William or Thomas rare sparks in a bleak landscape? Or was society more flexible than we give it credit for? Some evidence suggests that, particularly in cities, bastardy lost some of its stigma over time, especially if the child could be useful, talented, or married off discreetly. Others argue that the stain of illegitimacy clung tight no matter how well someone performed. You leave the manor house quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The nursemaid hums softly to the newborn in the lower room. Upstairs, the nobleman is asleep beside his lawful wife, dreaming perhaps of neither. Somewhere in between, a life has just begun, unwanted in one sense, but not unloved. And that may be the real secret here. For all the laws and shame, hearts still found ways to break the rules. Next, you'll slip into more radical spaces, where heretics preach salvation through sex, couples share each other as property of the divine, and free love means something far older and stranger than Woodstock ever imagined. You've wandered far off the main road now, past the manors and monasteries, beyond the reach of bishops and barons. You're in a clearing ringed by trees that seem to lean in just a little too close, as if they've heard something they shouldn't repeat. There's a small gathering around a fire, men and women, young and old, cloaked in simple wool and quiet defiance. One woman sings softly, her voice weaving through the smoke. Another reads from a scroll not recognised by any official church. You found the heretics, the radicals, the ones who dared to mix sex and salvation, and weren't all that sorry about it. Welcome to the fringe movements of medieval Christianity, where doctrine is loose, desire is spiritual, and nothing is quite what it seems. You're about to meet people who believed fervently that God lived not in celibacy, but in the body, that the divine could be accessed through touch, and that denying pleasure was the real sin. You sit beside a man named Elias, broad-shouldered and intense, with fingers stained from copying texts. He tells you he's part of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organised, wildly controversial movement that gained traction across parts of the Holy Roman Empire and Low Countries in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their core belief? That once a soul was truly united with God, it transcended sin, which meant that anything they did, anything, was no longer sinful, including sex, especially sex. The church, predictably, was horrified. The Brethren rejected sacraments, ignored clerical authority, And, most outrageously, some of their members claim to be literally divine. "I am God," one female mystic allegedly said, "and everything I do is holy." You imagine how well that went over in Rome. But the ideas spread. One woman, Marguerite Porete, wrote a mystical treatise called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which argued that the soul must surrender to divine love completely, even if that meant abandoning moral law. The church burned her at the stake in 1310, but her book kept circulating underground. Scholars still debate whether she practiced sexual mysticism herself, but others certainly did. You hear about sects where members stripped naked during rituals, both symbolic and literal acts of shedding sin. In some communities, couples shared each other as expressions of divine unity. One heretical group believed that true purity came only after full indulgence, that you had to experience all earthly pleasure before you could be truly free of it. Imagine explaining that to your confessor. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 14th century Bohemia, a radical sect called the Adamites lived communally, rejected clothing entirely, and believed that prelapsarian nudity, that is, the naked state of Adam and Eve before the fall, was the purest form of existence. They danced, sang and slept together in the open, claiming they had returned to Eden. The church sent troops. It did not end well. You listen as a woman named Clara speaks. She's in her 30s, with a crescent-shaped scar at her temple and eyes that watch everything. She talks about love, not just romantic love, but sacred eros. The flesh, she says, is the scroll where God writes. For her, sex isn't just human, it's holy. She describes how, in certain rituals, lovers recite psalms during climax, how prayer becomes a kind of foreplay, how kissing, when done with intention, becomes a sacrament. Not everyone in the group practices this openly. Some still wrestle with guilt, others walk both worlds, attending mass by day, then returning to the woods by night. And yet you sense a quiet conviction among them. They're not rebelling for the thrill. They genuinely believe that desire, when embraced honestly, brings them closer to the divine. Of course, the institutional church saw this as a threat. Not just the theology, but the liberation. If people didn't fear sin, how could you control them? If women claimed sexual autonomy as spiritual truth, how could you silence them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, if peasants and wanderers could find salvation without priests or confession, what was left for the hierarchy to do? Inquisition records from France and Germany are filled with frenzied accounts of these groups. But the line between truth and slander is thin. Did the brethren really engage in orgies? Or were they accused of it because they dared to question authority? Were the Adamites dangerous, or just inconveniently naked? Even modern scholars can't agree. Some see these movements as proto-feminist, proto-egalitarian responses to a repressive church. Others argue they were chaotic, misguided, and occasionally exploitative. You meet a young couple, Mira and John, who've been living among the Free Spirit followers for 2 years. They tell you they used to be married in the official church. There was love, Mira says, but no freedom. Here they sleep with other partners sometimes together, sometimes not. But always with consent, John adds. Always with grace. You can't tell if it's working, but they look content, not ecstatic, not ashamed, just peaceful in their bodies. Still, the risk is real. If they're caught, they could be tortured, executed, erased. One former member was burned for claiming unity with God through fornication. The word fornication was underlined in red ink, probably by someone with more fear than understanding. You realise how radical it truly is, to take something the church labelled shameful and claim it as holy. To say, my pleasure does not condemn me, it connects me to the divine. It's dangerous thinking, transformative thinking, and maybe, just maybe, it's why these groups keep reappearing in history like stubborn wildflowers. You burn them, bury them, condemn them, but they come back. You leave the clearing under a sky slick with stars. Someone sings softly behind you and the fire crackles like a heartbeat. You're not sure you believe what they believe, but you understand it. Because in a world built on control, sometimes the most sacred act is simply wanting without apology. Next, you'll find yourself behind monastery walls and convent doors, where abstinence is the rule, but longing lingers in silence, and where saints dream of kisses and monks carve their guilt into stone. The village fades behind you as the trees thin, giving way to a small stone chapel and an adjoining cluster of buildings that squat low against the wind. It's peaceful here. with rows of herbs growing beside a crumbling wall and a cow chewing slowly in a paddock, looking deeply uninterested in your arrival. But beyond the serenity, there's something else, a faint tension hanging in the air like smoke. You've come to witness one of medieval history's strangest obsessions, the trials of animals, where humans projected their lust, shame, and absurd moral panic onto creatures that couldn't defend themselves. That's right. In the Middle Ages, animals stood trial, real ones, with judges and witnesses, and accusations that usually sounded like fever dreams scribbled by a monk on a bad mushroom trip, and many of these trials, absurd as it sounds, centred on sex. You step into a small church courtroom where the scent of incense can't quite mask the underlying aroma of something more, barnyard. At the front, a pig sits chained beside a bailiff, squealing occasionally. The crowd watches grimly. The charge. Carnal knowledge of a child. The prosecutor, a local priest, reads the indictment aloud, voice trembling with equal parts disgust and piety. The audience nods solemnly. You want to scream. The pig scratches itself. This wasn't an isolated case. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of animal trials took place across medieval Europe. Pigs, bulls, goats, and even roosters were brought to courtrooms and accused of crimes, often sexual in nature. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was dressed in human clothes, tried for murder and unnatural acts, and hanged in public. In another case, a donkey was investigated for alleged lewd behaviour with a farmer. But, plot twist, the donkey was acquitted because multiple witnesses testified to her modesty and Christian demeanour. Yes, seriously, you sit beside an old scribe who's documenting today's proceedings. He sighs deeply and explains that these trials, while ridiculous now, were deadly serious then. To the medieval mind, animals weren't just beasts, they were part of God's ordered world. If a creature broke that order, it had to be punished. Otherwise divine justice would falter. In other words, they weren't just punishing the pig, they were restoring cosmic balance, or at least pretending to. But of course there's more going on here. Beneath the surface of these animal trials lurks a mess of human emotions, guilt, projection, repressed desire. In many cases, it seems likely that the animals were scapegoats, convenient targets when the real crimes were too horrifying to face directly. A child found dead? Blame the goat. A woman discovered with unexplained injuries? Blame the dog. The actual culprits, often neighbours, relatives, or authority figures, went unpunished, or unmentioned. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg, something no rooster should be able to do. The egg was declared the spawn of the devil, and the rooster was burned at the stake. Medieval people believed that a rooster's egg could hatch a basilisk, a monster so deadly its gaze could kill. You can almost imagine the priest scribbling that in his notebook, and then praying for a stiff drink. The church did its part to stoke these fears. Sermons warned that sexual sin could infect the world around you, that even animals might become instruments of corruption. One particularly creative preacher insisted that demons often entered livestock to commit impure acts and tempt the faithful, which meant somehow that your cow's lustful eyes were the devil's doing. There's a reason medieval bestiaries often included bizarre moral lessons beside animal descriptions. The lion was noble, the owl was wise, the weasel was a sex maniac, the hedgehog hoarded fruit and sin. Everything had meaning, usually sexual, usually terrifying. Scholars have tried to make sense of this medieval madness. Some say it reflects a deep anxiety about control, over the body, over the household, over nature itself. Animals were symbolic stand-ins for urges that couldn't be named aloud. Others argue it was a way of reinforcing power. Holding a trial, even a fake one for a pig, reminded everyone that justice flowed from the top down. The court ruled, the public watched. Order was restored, however farcically. But there's a darker side to all this. You come across records of women accused of unnatural acts with animals, usually based on hearsay, jealousy, or suspicion. These women were rarely tried fairly, often tortured, often executed. Their supposed partners were put down too, completing the ritual of shame. In some cases, there's no evidence of a crime at all, just a woman who lived alone, had too many cats, or refused to marry. You start to see how quickly fear and sexuality spiral into violence when mixed with superstition. Still, not everyone bought into it. In some town records, juries quietly acquitted animals, or judges delayed proceedings until they faded into obscurity. One case in 15th century Burgundy involved a group of rats accused of stealing grain. The rats were summoned to court, yes, literally summoned, but didn't show up. The defence lawyer argued they had a right to safe passage and were probably deterred by the presence of cats. The judge, possibly realising the absurdity, let it go. And yes, this actually happened, with written transcripts. You leave the courtroom shaking your head. Outside, the sky is grey, and a group of children run past chasing a chicken. The pig is led away, verdict pending. Life continues, bizarre and brutal in equal measure. And you wonder how many of these trials were less about animals and more about our own refusal to face ourselves. Because when people can't deal with their own desires, their own shame, they find something else to punish. A goat, a girl, a rooster with a mysterious egg. Next you'll find yourself under a death-shrouded sky, in a time when the plague tore through every certainty, and lust became both a last defiance and a whispered prayer before the coughing began. The coughing starts before you even reach the village. Dry and distant at first, like the crack of twigs in the wind. But as you get closer, it grows wetter, heavier, like something being torn from inside a body. You step into a town in mourning, though no one has had the time to carve the word into stone yet. The plague is here, bubonic, the Black Death. Call it what you like, it doesn't care. You can smell it in the air, sour and hot, like rot just beginning. A cart rolls by carrying more limbs than it should. Someone throws a rosary after it. Someone else throws up. And in the thick of it all, you find something unexpected. People still reaching for each other, still touching, still aching to feel alive even when death is already in the room. The world is ending again and again, and medieval people, it turns out, had the same reaction many of us might. Panic, prayer and pleasure. Some turned holy, others turned wild, and many drifted between the two depending on the hour, the sermon, or who was offering them a drink. You duck into a tavern, one of the few still open, and find it strangely full. The barkeep is coughing into his sleeve but still pouring ale. Two men argue about whether the world will end in fire or frogs. A woman is perched on a man's lap kissing him between drinks. Everyone here smells faintly of sweat and fear. You sit beside a weaver named Hal, who lost 3 brothers last week and hasn't blinked since Tuesday. "We're all damned," he says casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Might as well have some warmth on the way down." That attitude, surprisingly common, gave rise to a strange surge in erotic behaviour during the plague years. People flocked to brothels, not just for sex, but for comfort, for escape, for the illusion that life still had some sweetness left. Others engaged in spontaneous affairs, public displays of desire, and risked the wrath of both God and coughing neighbours to feel another body press against theirs. Some of it was desperation, some of it was defiance. When you believe the sky is about to fall, rules get fuzzy. Morality becomes optional. One chronicler from Avignon wrote bitterly of men who had never spoken to a whore before, now spending their last pennies in her bed, declaring love with every dying breath. He sounded disgusted, but you suspect he was also jealous. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In a few plague-stricken towns, local authorities actually relaxed restrictions on sex work during the worst waves of death. They figured if people were going to die, they might as well be distracted. In Paris, some brothels even received temporary protection, considered relief services by desperate city councils. Bodies for hire, one official wrote, to soothe the minds of the terrified. You try not to let the irony swallow you whole, but not everyone welcomed this frenzy of flesh. The church, as expected, thundered against it. Sermons doubled down. Priests called the plague a punishment for sexual sin, and accused those who continued to lie together of dragging the rest of the world into hell with them. The fornicators, one monk wrote, stir God's wrath into pestilence, which you have to admit has a certain poetic ring to it. Flagellant movements rose up in response, groups of men who whipped themselves through the streets, begging for forgiveness and driving out desire one lash at a time. Some of them forbade sex entirely, even between married couples, arguing that abstinence might spare their souls. Others, paradoxically, became so consumed with holiness that they slipped into a kind of ecstatic trance, moaning and writhing in what looked suspiciously like something else. Scholars still argue over whether these were spiritual seizures or thinly veiled orgasms. The line between pain and pleasure was blurred, especially when God was watching. And there's the rub. Everything became symbolic. A kiss was defiance. An orgasm was rebellion. Holding someone's hand as the boils rose on your neck wasn't just romance. It was war against despair. You meet a young woman named Elsa, cheeks flushed, eyes hollowed from weeks of bad sleep and bad air. She tells you she slept with the same man who buried her sister. "We didn't mean to," she says, voice barely above a whisper. "We just didn't want to be alone. Not that night." He's dead now. She isn't. Yet. Bodies were everywhere after all, in piles, in beds, in fevered dreams. The line between death and desire got twisted fast. Some believe that lust itself spread the plague, especially among the poor. Others believed it was the rich who brought the disease from their travels, their luxuries, their excess. Nobody really knew. The fleas didn't discriminate. But still, people tried to love, and sometimes they tried to love honestly. You hear of couples who married quickly, without priests, just to have someone's name to say in the dark. One young scribe wrote that he shared his bed with a girl from a rival village for a week during the worst of it. "We didn't speak much," he scribbled, "but we held each other. That was enough." There's no record of what happened to her, and yet amidst all this yearning, not all touches were tender. The breakdown of social order opened the door to exploitation too. Desperate women were forced into sex for shelter. Children were abandoned or sold. Brothels turned into death traps. There are accounts of men robbing plague corpses, then returning to their lovers without even washing their hands. The sickness didn't just rot lungs, it rotted conscience. Still, even in this decay, you feel something deeply human holding on. In a makeshift shelter outside the town walls, two people share a thin blanket, their fingers barely brushing, and that simple connection carries more power than 100 sermons. They aren't pretending they're safe, they aren't even pretending they're clean. They're just choosing to feel something before the lights go out. Scholars today still wrestle with the paradox of play and passion. Some argue the increased eroticism was a natural response to trauma. Others suggest it was always there, just unmasked by mortality. When everything else is taken, the body remains. And what people did with their bodies during the plague says as much about resilience as it does about fear. As you walk away from the town, the coughing fades behind you. The night is heavy, but the stars are shockingly bright. Somewhere another cart is being loaded. Somewhere else a kiss lands on a fevered cheek. Life, stubborn as it is, goes on. Next, you'll step into the final rooms of this world. A place of last confessions and long shadows, where death meets desire in stained glass and tombstone carvings. And lust writes itself into memory, even after the lights go out. The cathedral looms ahead like a ship made of shadow and stone, its spires cutting into a sky bruised with twilight. You walk toward it slowly, boots echoing on worn cobblestones slick with yesterday's rain. This is the end of the journey, not just yours, but theirs, the lords, the lovers, the outlaws, the sinners and saints. You've seen them in beds, in brothels, behind monastery walls and beneath plague-ridden blankets. Now you're stepping into the place where they all eventually come to be remembered, or to be forgotten. Inside the light is dim, caught in coloured glass that scatters fragments of saints across the flagstones. The air smells of wax and old prayers, layered thick like dust. You pass rows of wooden pews and an altar dressed in gold, but what draws your eye are the tombs, dozens of them. Stone coffins stacked along the walls and carved into the floors, each etched with Latin, dates, and the soft lies of remembrance. Faithful husband, beloved wife, pillar of virtue. You pause at one, a knight in full armour, a woman beside him, both hands folded, eyes shut, lips still parted slightly. Lovers cast in stone, and yet you can't help but wonder, did they even like each other? Death in the Middle Ages was everywhere, and yet for all its daily presence it never stopped being dramatic. People planned for it obsessively, rewrote their wills, purchased indulgences, commissioned artwork, and even in death the question of sex lingered. Who had been with whom? Who had strayed? Who had touched desire too closely and burned for it? The Church's vision of the afterlife was rigid. Sinners faced damnation, the pure found paradise. But human memory wasn't so tidy, and neither were the gravestones. You run your fingers along one monument that's clearly had its inscription scraped off and rewritten. The new name barely hides the old grooves. Rumour has it the man buried here was excommunicated for keeping two wives, one in town, one in the countryside, and neither knew about the other until his funeral. Apparently they met while placing flowers. Things got ugly. Someone threw a candle. But these aren't just monuments, they're warnings, celebrations, excuses. The language of virtue was often code. Chaste sometimes meant got caught and repented. Modest could mean kept her secrets well. One widow, buried with a carved lily and the word pudica, meaning pure, was later revealed in court records to have run a high-end brothel out of her wine cellar. You almost admire the symmetry. Everyone dies. Not everyone gets carved in stone as a virgin saint. Then there's the art. Death and lust shared the same palette. You trace the lines of a stained glass window showing Mary Magdalene, not kneeling in repentance, but washing Christ's feet with her hair, her face tender and a little too intimate for comfort. Behind her, a bishop scowls, as if he can feel the confusion she causes. For centuries, Magdalene was the church's favourite symbol of fallen womanhood and redemption. A safe place to park all the unease around female sexuality. Want, sanctified. Desire, domesticated. On a column nearby, someone long ago carved a tiny pair of intertwined figures, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. Their faces are rough, weathered by time, but their position is unmistakable. You wonder if a bored mason left them there on a dare, or if it was a tribute, maybe even a memory. Because for all the church's lectures and threats, desire still seeped into the very walls, quietly, persistently. You walk into a side chapel and find a display of death masks, faces cast from wax and painted to resemble the deceased. Most are stoic, a few are smiling. One has lips parted just slightly, teeth barely showing. It's unsettling. She was a noblewoman, they say, who died in childbirth. But her journals survived, and in them she wrote long passages about a lover she never named. He brought her pressed violets, touched her face like she might vanish. She never mentioned her husband, not once. And here's your fringe fact of the night. Some medieval tombs were designed with transy sculptures, effigies showing the person as they were in life on top, and beneath it a rotting corpse. Flesh above, decay below, a reminder that beauty fades, bones endure, and lust, no matter how vivid, ends here. Or seems to, but even in death, desire found its echoes. You read about ghost stories, widows dreaming of long-dead lovers who visit them at night, spectral hands brushing thighs, kisses like cold breath. Monks wrote of temptations that lingered in their dreams, voices of old lovers whispering from beyond. Were they hauntings, memories, guilt? No one could say. Scholars still argue over how medieval people balanced their fear of damnation with the inevitability of disease. Some suggest they lived in constant cognitive dissonance, publicly condemning what they privately craved. Others believe they were more honest than we give them credit for, navigating lust and sin as parts of life, not contradictions but companions. Either way, the tombstones don't tell the whole story. You leave the cathedral as the bells begin to ring. A funeral procession passes you, mourners in black, a casket of polished oak, incense trailing behind. Among them walks a woman with her hand clutched tight to a locket. You don't ask what's inside, you already know. Outside, the wind has shifted. You're standing at the edge of a world that once felt eternal but is now quiet, save for your footsteps. You've traced the shape of medieval lust, from the giggles behind market stalls to the ritualized silences of the convent, from flagellation to fornication, from passion to plague. You've seen how people touched and were touched, how they confessed, denied, longed, burned, and finally were buried. Next, as the candles flicker low and the story slips into silence, it's time to wind down with a final breath, a soft descent into sleep, where history rests beside you like a lover with secrets yet to tell. The fire is low now, a hush settling in like dust on forgotten parchment. You sit quietly, letting everything you've seen drift through your thoughts, the low laughter in taverns, the whispered prayers behind cloistered doors, the creak of a bed frame that shouldn't be making that sound in a nunnery, the rustle of parchment scribbled with secrets too tender for the light of day. It's all there, folding gently into memory. You've walked through a world that both feared and worshipped desire, where sermons warned you away from lust even as saints dreamed of divine kisses, where rules were written in stone but broken in soft haylofts, by candlelight or beneath the weight of too much wine. You've met noblewomen who took lovers in silence, monks who wept after pleasure, poets who turned their longing into art, and peasants who held each other close as the plague drew its last breath. You've learned that sin, in medieval times, wasn't just something done. It was something felt, carried, confessed, and sometimes embraced. Maybe you've come away a little more sceptical of those stained glass halos. Or maybe you've come to understand that the past was never as clean or as cold as textbooks like to pretend. The truth is, desire has always pulsed just beneath the surface, messy, tender, shameful, sacred. So as you ease under the covers tonight, remember, history isn't made only in battlefields and courts, but in bedrooms and back alleys, in love letters and lace hems, in quiet, aching moments that no one thought to write down but somehow survived anyway. The lights are low, the story's done, and the past for now can rest.